Hey everybody, welcome to another BTR stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, and it is an immense pleasure to be once again with the one and only Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. It is a great pleasure to finally be here with everybody. It's been a very long time coming. It's been several months now, I think. I don't even know like how long it's been since we've last talked. And I think that right now it is a very special time. Everything is changing, and your new book, which I loved very much, Fundamental Thinkers, I think gets right to the point of what is at stake right now as far as the kind of person we end up building up from all these changes that are going on right now, from the internet addicted last men that we're observing, as well as a lot of these third worldist types online that are creeping up, trying to get everybody to go after anything that has to do with progress. And that is one of the main things I think that really drew me to yourself, Jason, is that despite having a lot of views that people would consider to be, right wing and based and red pill, whatever you want to call it, you are nonetheless a progressive. And I think that people forget that in your work. And I just want to open it up to ask, why is it that you decided to write Fundamental Thinkers right now after all this time? And then I want to concentrate on the whole idea of how do we create this Übermensch, this Overman, not just borrowing from Nietzsche, but borrowing from Heidegger, from Hegel, from Comte, from Aristotle, from Plato, bringing all these great minds together. So, Dr. Jorjani, once again, thank you so much for being here. And everybody, don't forget to like, smash that subscribe button, and comment and share this with everybody you know. And patreon.com/break the rules. Become a patron today. Anyway, Jason, you have the floor, my friend.
Lev, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I believe it has been 4.5 months, if I'm not mistaken.
Too
the last
long.
show we did together, yeah, it's been too long, and maybe later in the Q&A we'll get into where my head has been in the hiatus. But I think it was in New York in person that we did our last show together, if I'm not mistaken. And
No, I think it was right after that. We also did one about Iran.
Oh, yes, we did. So, no,
yeah.
yeah, we did. When I got back, we did a follow-up to the one in New York live. That's right. So about 4 months, 3.5 to 4 months ago, something like that. In any case, great to be back with you and your audience. Now, if anyone forgets that progress is at the core of my work, then they've forgotten essentially everything about what I stand for as a thinker. So, nice intro there. Yeah, I mean, look, the fundamental orientation of my work is in terms of evolution conceived not merely as aimless change, but as constructive development, and an ordered expansion of creative power and the complexity of consciousness, which is to say progress. And, we can get into how the ideas of order and progress are intrinsically intertwined and ultimately inextricable from each other in a way that Auguste Comte grasped very adequately. But yeah, it's at the core of my work. I mean, extending from my interest in an archaic proto-philosopher like Zarathustra, all the way to how it is that I interpret Nietzsche and Heidegger in a very different vein from some of those people on the right who somehow have delusions that these thinkers are, I don't know, affirming hierarchical, paternalistic, traditional modes of life. The people on the right who understand Nietzsche and Heidegger most adequately are actually the ones who condemn them. Like, for example, the really puritanical Evelyn's, who will adhere to Julius Evola's interpretation, especially in Ride the Tiger, of both Nietzsche and Heidegger as degenerates. So, and this is because, Evola rightly recognized that although Nietzsche and then Heidegger in his wake are surmounting, overcoming a kind of naive enlightenment commitment to progress as a purely rational process of increasing understanding of the putative nature of reality, still both Nietzsche and Heidegger are committed to a kind of eschatological, thinking, a kind of apocalyptic teleology that is ultimately progressive, and that I think is often mistakenly attributed to Christianity, whereas in fact, as Nietzsche understood well, it comes from the thinking of Zarathustra and was only perversely adopted and adapted by Christianity from out of the fundamental impact that ancient Iranian thought had on, the Eastern Mediterranean cultural milieu where Christianity arose in the Hellenistic era. So in any case, as a proviso, a few remarks on progress. Why did I decide to write this book? Well, this is a subject that I addressed in my recent interview with the warrior philosopher, with our friend Patrick, who, by the way, is the co-publisher of this book. This is the first book that I have published with DVX, with their nice Roman, icon, so their nice Roman totem on their logo. Patrick and Lance Legion run DVX Press, and I'm very happy to be working with them. This is going to be the first of a series of volumes that will be published by DVX. By series, I don't mean that one is necessarily connected to the other insofar as you have to read any one before another, but it's going to be essentially a set of books that publishes my various essays in a more or less thematic way. And this is the first of them. The next one is going to be on the occult. It's going to be a much thicker volume of essays on the occult. So I hate to repeat myself in one interview after another. Therefore, and we'll really endeavor to break some new ground here with regard to the content of the book. But very long story short, why I decided to write this at this time, or why I decided to publish these essays first, is that in terms of opening new pathways of thinking and taking a moment to reflect on the trajectory of one's career for the sake of, potential reorientations, new avenues of contemplation, it's always good to go back to the fundamental thinkers and, revisit the backbone of the history of philosophy, which was very much at the core of my work from the start. I mean, the essays that were published in this volume, Lovers of Sophia, even though, it was, I believe, the third or fourth of my books to come out in print, they predate Prometheus and Atlas. And so it's very clear how my work proceeded from a deep and, in some cases, radically unorthodox reading of some of the fundamental thinkers. And that's something that we can get into today as well with regard to the question of the Overman, or the highest human type, and the various ways in which these fundamental thinkers have contributed to crafting an image of that throughout the history of philosophy. Because actually, I would argue that Nietzsche represents less of a break with Plato and Aristotle than a lot of moderns have imagined. And that when Nietzsche is taken to be the sort of inverter of Platonism and, deconstructor of a representational conception of truth, based on the mind's relationship to a putatively objective reality, a kind of deconstruction that is then furthered by Heidegger. That view of Nietzsche's role in the history of philosophy and the implications it has for his conception of the Übermensch and the Übermensch's relation to ethos and to orienting values and so forth, that conception is based on misattributing Platonism or a Neoplatonic worldview to Plato and Aristotle, whereas in fact that worldview with its kind of objective representation of reality, its macrocosm, microcosm relation between the cosmos and the mind, is actually a product of Hellenistic thinking at the time when Christianity arose around, 300, 400 AD, around about the time of Plotinus and thereafter. For reasons that we can get into in some degree of detail, the way I read Plato and Aristotle, again, somewhat heretically, is that their understandings of what counts for developing a more adequate conception of things and for operating based on knowledge rather than being subject to delusions and baseless opinions, is a lot closer to Nietzsche's own understanding than people give Plato and Aristotle credit for. So anyway, we can go into that. Oh, there you go. You showed up a double for 1 second on my screen, but then now it's corrected.
No worries.
Go ahead.
No worries. Yes. So when it comes to certain people out there, let's say who, speaking of Julius Evola, people who I would say go much further away from your ideal, to say the least, of what the Übermensch should be, would be one certain gentleman, Alexander Dugin, who I'm sure you're familiar with when it came to his recent tweet saying, "Whites, they are destroyed the world and themselves. To be white means to be nihilist. It is self-hatred race. It caused so many troubles to others and to itself. It lost the right to be something. No arguments to support their existence." But then that was followed up after he got, as you know, this big backlash with, "I am more white than almost all of you. I am Indo-European, Aryan, and proud of it. You are wrong, Aryans. Liberal, weak, pervert. You are modern. This kind of whiteness is shame. Real whites are Iranians, Indians, Evolians. All the rest is thrash."
The thrash there at the end really takes the cake. Oh, man. Well, as I said on X, and by the way, if anyone's serious about following me, you really have to get on X. X is my principal platform, okay? Everything else is really secondary in terms of where I'm active. But as I said on X, I mean, look, this statement is bad. This is bad. There was another one where he basically said that, we just need to clasp our hands in prayer and adopt Orthodox Christianity and wait for the Lord's grace to descend upon us, as the apocalypse unfolds. And so, between these various statements, one can see that this man never had the constitution of a philosopher. I mean, it's one thing for a poor soul like Bergson, who, despite all his brilliance and, the very constructive work that he did, kind of very quietly, very, very quietly converted to Christianity toward the end of his life, to have like a Christian burial and a Christian, a Christian burial, essentially. That's not great, for Bergson to disgrace himself like that before the end of his life. But Dugin has spent now decades basically being an evangelist, a preacher for Orthodox Christianity, and the absolutely ill-considered way in which he is now engaging in racist attacks against white people further underlines the fact that this man has neither the cast of mind nor the ethical constitution to really rightly be considered a philosopher. He is ultimately a glorified propagandist and an evangelist. And, I've been suggesting this for some time now, and I think it's become abundantly clear to people. So, I mean, we can comment on that or analyze in a little more detail if you'd like, although I don't want to give too much, too much oxygen to Dugin. But in short, as I think is pretty clear from my various statements and especially my writings throughout the years, I mean, no higher intellectual activity, including and especially philosophy and the sciences, that derived from out of it in a serious, conceptually grounded way would exist but for white people. And let me tell you, as a fellow Aryan, okay, who has both European heritage, but then also a paternal Iranian heritage, and the Iranians are, of course, the quintessential Aryans. Iranian is simply the Middle Persian form of the ancient Persian word Aryan, okay? Ancient Scythian, ancient Persian word Aryan. That's what the country used to be called, Aryana, and the people called themselves Aryoi. Okay, so as a fellow Aryan, let me tell you that despite the significant contributions that the Iranian branch of the Indo-European family made to philosophy and the sciences and technological development in various periods throughout history, but especially, say, between 900 and 1150 AD, the overwhelming majority of higher intellectual activity and techno-scientific development on this planet owes itself to the European and American branches of the Aryan world. And by the way, this whole notion that, Aryan only refers to the Indo-Aryan or Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family is completely fallacious. It's completely fallacious. The word Aryan in ancient Persian and Scythian and the various Iranian languages derives from an older Indo-European term, herios, which the Greeks adapted into heroes. And it was a self-designator for a large group of people who later were understood to be European, including the Celts, who refer also to their country as Erin, which is a cognate of Iran, meaning the Aryan place, okay? And so it's a perfectly legitimate reference to the entire, what you could call the white race or Caucasian people or whatever other name you want to give to it. And that only went out of fashion after World War II for obvious reasons, because the term was politically appropriated by the Nazis. And, look, a lot of sheepish Iranians like to act as if, the German appropriation of the term Aryan was completely illegitimate and like the Nazis were misappropriating, Iran and whatever. No. Look, you owe the Germans for the science of Iranology. The discipline of Iranology was really grounded by the works of Hegel and the seriousness with which the Germans took Iran as fundamental to progress in human history, rather than seeing Greece necessarily as the inception of a higher civilizational trajectory on the earth. That's reflected in Nietzsche only because from the time of Hegel and even earlier, Germans were recognizing the importance of Iran as the matrix of the Aryan world, and Greece as secondary, and then Rome as tertiary. Okay, so this view of history in modern Europe really begins with the Germans. And so, it's actually, they were honoring Iran by, trying to identify themselves with the ancient Persians and Scythians and so forth, and see that as the wellspring of the civilization that eventually was framed as Western. So, look, be that as it may, this raving Orthodox lunatic, the degree of conceptual confusion in his, in all likelihood, drunken, statements on X is beyond belief.
Do you see it serving the Russian government more than just him wanting to rant about certain things that he enjoys thinking about? Because at the end of the day, the kind of picture that gets created of this global South, third worldist, whatever you want to call it, configuration is one that would unite together Russia, China, certain other third world countries against what they would see as this debaucherous Western civilization that has lost the mandate of heaven, so to speak.
Yeah, obviously. And again, that only reifies the perversity of his attempt to misappropriate the Aryan heritage, because the Russian agenda that Dugin is serving is the subsumption of the white race into an undifferentiated, collectivistic, Asian mass, where, Indians, Chinese people especially, and then Russians are all slowly integrated into this traditionalist BRICS order, okay? And the Russians are this like sort of, marginally white element that over time is like melted into, the undifferentiated mass of the Asian quasi-Mongol, BRICS world, right? And that maybe will bring a certain degree of scientific and cultural eccentricity to the BRICS sphere, right? But that won't be guilty of, from a Christian perspective, or from a Chinese, Confucian perspective, the sin or the departure from the mandate of heaven that the Promethean aspirations and, enterprising force of discovery and innovation represents in, the West, right? So everything about the West that ultimately led to artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, but also to parapsychology, and that lies behind the Western ambition to explore not just space, but also time as, a frontier for the expansion of human consciousness. All of that is interpreted as somehow satanic or counter-traditional or at odds with the mandate of heaven from this, Asiatic perspective that Dugin wants to subsume Aryan identity under, okay? So it's a fundamental betrayal of the Promethean spirit of the Aryan peoples. And one of the things that you see, now we're getting a little bit far from fundamental thinkers, but not entirely, and in a way that I can bring it back. One of the things that you see throughout my entire corpus is an insistence on the Promethean interpretation of the Aryan heritage. In other words, Dugin with his, the Indians are the real Aryans and all this. Hinduism in its basic structure, especially as reflected in the form of sociopolitical organization that it leads to, minus this little experiment with democracy since the British left India, okay? Hinduism in its basic structure, in other words, the Vedic, Vedantic tradition is in its essential form no different from any other hierarchical, paternalistic, Asiatic social organization. So on a deeper level, India can be very easily integrated into a single world order with China and with a Russia that embraces the most paternalistic Orthodox interpretation of Christianity. Okay, again, the same interpretation of Christianity that was responsible for Hypatia of Alexandria literally being skinned alive and burned at the stake by Kirill, their own bishop and saint.
The same name, by the way, that's shared by the current head of the Russian Orthodox Church as well. But one caveat I wanted to add is that if you look at the breeding program, for lack of a better term, back in the day that the Mongols instituted in medieval Muscovy, it had to do with not like mixing of different peoples, but it was just this breeding of Russians, which was not a course towards any kind of progression in the good sense. These are people that were kept completely away from any kind of literature, any kind of knowledge. And I think that regardless of, whatever people may say about DNA or genetics, I could see the genetics lowering themselves based on how little of a quality civilization they had there. So you did end up having obviously outliers like Chekhov. He came from a family of Russian serfs. But I think that the pull downwards was so strong for so many people that, you don't need to talk about, well, if the Chinese and the Russians combine together into this permanent serf class, then Dugin's mission will be complete. I would say it was complete long before that, just with the Russians themselves, which brings me back to Nietzsche and his idea of the master race.
Let me not get sidetracked, though, Lev, before we go there, okay? The point that I was trying to make, and I agree with you, by the way, and unfortunately, to a certain extent, a similar thing was done by the Mongols in Iran that led to a protracted decline of Iranian civilization. But the point that I was trying to make is this, that you're a moron to take Hindu India as representative of the Aryan. And a lot of right-wing Europeans have a tendency to do this. To the extent they engage with India at all, it's the Vedic system because they like the caste organization of society, right? And they also feel like, they will be sort of revered as, basically supermen, by the native Indian population. And lamentably, a large number of Indians actually who were nationalists and against British colonialism practically, worshipped Hitler and some of his Nazi associates. They saw him as a kind of Kalki avatar. So you tend to have this emphasis of India, whereas this is completely retarded and perverse insofar as what it is that makes the Aryan heritage distinct and radically different from all of the other cultures on the planet is precisely the breaking with a paternalistic, hierarchical, unquestioned, primordial conception of tradition and the cyclical view of time that goes along with it, where there's a golden age, silver age, a bronze age, a decline of the ages leading ultimately to the Kali Yuga, and then back again to the Satya Yuga or the golden age, right? Where the gods have to come down and reestablish order on the earth from out of chaos. What makes the Aryan heritage different from that cyclical conception of time and that hierarchical, unquestioned traditionalist ordering of society that's common to every other culture on the planet is precisely the idea of progress and the willingness to deconstruct tradition and open up the space for creativity and innovation, creativity in the arts and literature and, scientific and technological discovery and innovation, okay? And of course, all of the thinkers who are covered in this book, going back to Heraclitus, represent the backbone in that historical trajectory. So Dugin is ridiculous. I mean, he's ridiculous. Like, this is precisely what constitutes the genius of the Aryan world. This progressive lineage, not to call it a tradition, this, future-oriented trajectory, which began with Plato's absolutely heretical, just like radically counter-traditional suggestion that philosophers should redesign the religion that the majority of people in society adhere to, and that basic institutions like patriarchy should be questioned and women should be given an opportunity to cultivate themselves as individuals in all areas of human endeavor, right? I mean, Plato's thinking in some ways is radically counter-traditional precisely insofar as it's able to open up possibilities for what ultimately becomes techno-scientific development, including social engineering, which reaches its peak in a project like the positivism of Auguste Comte, right? But whether it's Plato or whether it's Aristotle, also nearly being executed by the Athenians because he was like writing the constitutions of various city-states on contract, which showed how little naive or blind allegiance he had to any political order and how far above the demos he saw himself and his fellow social planners in their capacity to adjust the constitution of different city-states based on their cultural proclivities into a form that would allow those particular people to have a more constructive relationship to fundamental virtues and principles that would be conducive to the cultivation of the human person, right? That kind of dynamic, cross-cultural thinking deeply scared the Athenians. And
as it should.
Yes, and so you see this throughout the history of philosophy, and ultimately, you know, it culminates in figures like Nietzsche and Heidegger, which, you know, as you are about to delve into, are presenting us with an image of, in the case of Heidegger, a fundamental threat to the boundary conditions of human existence on the part of the world in framing power of technological science. And in the case of Nietzsche, a vision of what kind of transformation and further evolution of humanity would be adequate to a successful navigation of that challenge, right? And our ability to transit into what Nietzsche calls a higher history, and what Hegel would have seen as the end of merely human history, right? This is an eschatological vision, a kind of progressive teleology that somebody like Dugin has to reject entirely as satanic and anathema to any divinely sanctified, you know, properly ordered world, which effectively means that this charlatan ideologue has to throw, you know, the baby of philosophy out with the bathwater of its history, leaving him, you know, as a, you know, some kind of naked Orthodox monk in a drained out tub. All right, so this is where we're at with him, and with all of the, you know, rather retarded, aimless, lost young people who are grasping on somebody as impoverished as Dugin as a source of meaning, you know, in this time when we're facing such urgent challenges, and, you know, where the imaginative capacity to think outside the box and to be able to see innovative solutions is more important than ever.
Well, it is called the retard right for a reason. That's the new term that's been gaining popularity recently among people, not just Dugin, but people like Nick Fuentes or Sneeko or, you know, Candace Owens, you know, people of that sort, kind of the bread and circus people, you know, Dave Smith. But the issue for me comes in when we're talking about something like the Overman. If we're seeing the sheer amount of people that are being attracted to these kind of idiotic ideologues, then the concern is, will there be this kind of, I know I'm kind of pushing forward a bit here, but this is a very, I think, important thing for us to tackle, this bifurcation that Nietzsche talked about when it comes to there being the Overman and then there being the last man. It just seems like the amount of distraction that I think a lot of people, including a lot of smart people, find themselves to be in, because, you know, back then in the golden age of Greece and Rome, they didn't have smartphones to distract themselves with, you know, all of these great philosophers. So the concern here is that how much is it going to be, as you and Nietzsche were talking about, this bifurcation of this Overman who is able to resist all of these creature comforts, versus there being this kind of, how do you say it, this kind of personality who's ruthless, charismatic, clever, and disciplined enough to game the system, but at the same time, they're still fundamentally enslaved to these kind of distracted desires that our smartphones and various other tech is going to bring.
Okay, so it's a very complex question. Philosophy arose historically in opposition to two different types of person. One was the unreflective, common man, blindly moved by baseless opinions. Okay? And this human type was a particularly serious problem in the society in which philosophy really crystallized, namely classical Athens, because it was a democracy. And so, since the common man had exceptionally significant power in this society, it was, all the more an acute problem that the majority were basing incredibly important decisions, not only in their personal lives, but in terms of the life of the city-state, on baseless and unexamined opinions. So that's one type of person that Plato has his dramatic persona of Socrates ceaselessly questioning throughout his dialogues. The other type, though, is the sophist, who's an incredibly sophisticated, shrewd, analytically competent person, capable of crafting charismatically compelling arguments for any and all cases when it's useful, and when the sophist is being paid enough, like a lawyer would be paid, right? To come up with that kind of oration for, any number of bad actors in society, whether it's corrupt politicians or merchants who want various mercantile policies changed or whatever, right? And unfortunately, 2,500 years later, we're still dealing with both of these types, right? I mean, it goes without mention that the vast majority of people, especially since the collapse of our modern educational system, which has collapsed in terms of its integrity, in terms of its being based on the canon, in terms of its, analytical rigor, it has effectively collapsed in the last few decades. So especially after the collapse of the modern educational system into postmodern relativism and cultural relativism and identity politics and so on and so forth, we're obviously still dealing with the first type, where 95% of people, at least in society, if not 99%, are completely aimless, deluded. I hesitate even to say individuals for reasons that we'll come to when we talk about Heidegger and his very legitimate conception of das Mann, or the they, the inauthentic, undifferentiated mass of people. So this mass still leads its life based on unjustified and not properly examined opinions. And then we're still dealing with the sophists, where when you hear that Palantir has a manifesto now, or there's like an Anduril manifesto or whatever, there are evidently so-called philosophers, which I hear are particularly influenced by Machiavelli, big surprise there, right? Working in the think tanks of companies for Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and so forth, coming up with effectively sophistical arguments to justify corporate policies, right? And, corporatist agendas. So we're still dealing with those two types. And your question is whether the concrete conditions that could lead to the enhancement of a subset of mankind into effectively a new race of supermen, and thereby also an artificial speciation of humanity into, on the one hand, superhumans, and on the other hand, subhumans, increasingly dehumanized, increasingly inhuman, people that effectively are used as tools by the Superman. Whether this, whether the concrete conditions, the various tools and techniques that would facilitate that transformation are going to be misused by the kind of Machiavellian sophists of our time to establish an oligarchical elite is effectively what you could call it, an oligarchical elite that would exploit the rest of humanity, or whether, you know, some more fundamental psychological and spiritual transformation can really take place that would make more ethical and constructive use of these technologies. You wanted to add something to what you were saying?
I just want to make sure, and I think you understand where I'm coming from here. I'm putting into question the very idea that a Superman is able to come about in this kind of state, as opposed to whoever would be designated the Superman would just be a slightly more intelligent, more cunning version of whatever we're left with, just because of this gravitational force of technological distraction. That in order to have somebody that would be so disciplined, and again, like, I don't know, that's why I was talking about back then, during those ancient times, sure, they had bread and circuses, but they didn't have the ability to generate pretty much whatever you want to on your phone using AI. So I don't know.
So Plato defines the project of philosophy against both of these human types, okay? And he effectively argues that society needs to be reorganized in such a way that oligarchs cannot use sophists to manipulate masses who deal only in baseless opinions, right? So that an educational system and a political structure needs to be crafted that will allow people who are fundamentally driven by the desire for discovery and by the will to higher intellectual comprehension, including comprehension of the right form of society for the maximal cultivation of the human person, right? So the social order would be reorganized in a way where those individuals could provide guidance to the masses through a well-structured educational system and meritocratically afford each individual the capacity to cultivate their own potential to the greatest extent possible, right? And a political order that's going to forcibly constrain the personality types that would otherwise tyrannize over society in the form of an oligarchy. And the kinds of proposals that Plato puts forward for that, which again, I summarize in, Fundamental Thinkers, they are extremely radical, okay? Like, for example, no one but the philosophical class and the auxiliaries, are basically stormtroopers, who serve the purposes of the philosophers, are allowed to possess weaponry. So there's no general right to bear arms in this society. By contrast, or rather on the inverse of that, the oligarchs aren't allowed to basically, build up arms depots on their personal property. Like, the vast majority of the population of the United States holds currently more weaponry than the US military. There are so many, frankly, rednecks and hillbillies in this country who, with their, subscriptions to Guns and Ammo and their, local shooting shops, have amassed armories of all kinds of automatic weapons and, massive arsenals, okay? That could be used against the state, or that could be used to create a new state in a condition of from out of a condition of chaos. So Plato in Republic says that you can't have this, okay? You can't, because, it's one thing when it's rednecks and hillbillies, it's another thing when it's Peter Thiel and Palantir. And you can have basically corporate feudal states arise that are more powerful than the nominal government, and that then can tyrannize over the population, right? And so in his ideal vision of society, weapons are kept out of the hands of the people who would become oligarchs, or who would set up a tyrannical kingship, or whatever other system. And by the way, he thinks that democracy will always, in effect, be an oligarchy, because he thinks that the mob can be effectively, easily manipulated by oligarchs through, sophists and people who are capable of crafting various forms of sophistry to manipulate the masses. You were going to say something.
I want to rewind it a little bit, though, because what I think also has to be paid attention to, the primary thing here, the unmoved mover, so to speak, of instituting these kind of programs is still someone who, let's say, would be the proto-Übermensch that would have to resist all of the seductions of creature comforts, of technology, of AI, of whatever thing enables people to, let's say, doom scroll. And I don't know about yourself, but I'm sure that there are a lot of very intelligent people out there that have succumbed to the kind of things with technology, like doom scrolling, for instance, that they're aware they shouldn't do at the same time they've been caught. So what you're saying would require such a radical departure from that. My concern is that who we're going to be left with, even if they're smart people, are still going to have that part of their will succumbing to these kind of things.
Yeah, let's get there. I fully see this is where you want to go, and we'll get there, okay, step by step. So I just want to give a few more examples. So arms are kept out of the possession of oligarchs, and at the same time, the philosopher rulers are prohibited from having personal bank accounts or amassing individual wealth. So those who have the sovereign authority to govern society and have a class of essentially knights bound to their service, they are not allowed to amass private wealth or personal property. They have to live effectively a communistic life. And this extends to not having nuclear families, because nepotism is an obvious source of corruption. And if you're more loyal to your family than you are to the welfare of the state, well, that by itself, is unjust and is going to, lead to, various social problems. So his proposals are extremely radical in a text like Republic. Then when you look at Auguste Comte, Comte criticizes Plato's proposals in all kinds of specific ways. But if you step back and look at the big picture of the form of social organization that he's proposing for his positivist society, and the type of human person that would constitute the sociocratic leadership that essentially he sees as a secular priesthood for this, progressive social order, it's ultimately the same as what Plato is aspiring towards. Okay, I mean, again, this is a question of being able to see a similarity of form despite a difference of content. There are lots of specific differences in the proposals. Some of them are very significant, like, for example, when it comes to the proper role of women in society, or exactly what role the philosopher, ruler, or to put it in Comte's terms, the sociocratic leader, exactly what role this type of person will have with respect to the state, where in Plato's case, the guardians are literally the sovereigns of the state. And in Comte's case, he says, no, actually, they should be a moral power that is legally separate from the state, so that ultimately its authority exceeds the authority of the state, and that it's not corrupted by state power defined narrowly and technically, right? There are these specific differences. But the type of person that Comte is, outlining here in his vision of the positivist society is ultimately the same super intellectual. I'll use the word altruistic because Comte coined the term. Auguste Comte coined the term altruism to refer to a kind of selflessness or self-overcoming, where all of those petty desires that produce a tyrant in the form of the old oligarchy that Plato was already interested in resisting are overcome in the context of one's persona, by the compelling power of one's perception of the beautiful, and by one's deep desire for higher intellectual cultivation, and by the satisfaction that one gets from the beauty of a justly ordered society, and so forth, right? Like, these are the facets of the persona of the leader in both Comte's system and Plato's, despite the specific differences. And I think that when you look at what Georg Hegel envisions as the end of history, insofar as that end of history, the end of the historical process of progress, produces a particular human type that's characterized by the freedom from unconscious adherence to various dialectical forces, and what Hegel calls absolute self-consciousness of the human person with regard to all the factors that can condition our thought individually and our behavior on a social level. Comte's ideal conception of the human being and Plato's are very much resonant with what Hegel imagined as the fully actualized human potential at the end of history. But the interesting question to really try to get at where you want to take us is whether Hegel was wrong about the master-slave dialectic, because part of Hegel's argument for how the various changes in the basic frameworks of knowledge and the fundamental principles of social organization will eventually resolve themselves, right? How various successive political revolutions and paradigm shifts in the sciences will eventually converge on this society constituted by free and self-conscious individuals. A very integral element of that is Hegel's argument that such an end of history would be a full overcoming of what he calls the master-slave dialectic, which is the idea that in various successive stages of history, the power differential between people who are in a position of mastery, who are overlords, who are in command and control, versus those who they exploit and who are subservient to them, this power differential represents an alienation of consciousness in the individual human person, such that the masters in a society, whether they're ancient Greek tyrants, or whether they're medieval feudal lords, or whether they're modern corporate oligarchs, or whatever form they take in particular, those people are enslaved themselves insofar as their unconscious and exploitative relationship toward the people who they've enslaved or who they're exploiting expresses a kind of psychological alienation which they themselves on an individual level have not yet been able to overcome. And this is where Marx's whole communist project develops from out of Hegel, where Marx proposes that the only form of society that's capable of fundamentally and comprehensively overcoming that alienation is communism. Okay, that was not Hegel's own solution. In any case, Nietzsche is proposing something diametrically at odds with the direction in which Marx takes Hegel, namely that the master-slave dialectic cannot be ultimately resolved in the way that Hegel imagined it would be, because the further evolution of humanity into a kind of superhuman that in some instances Nietzsche says would be as different from man as man is from the ape, that further evolution of humanity creates a form of life which is so self-justifying and in lack of and lacking in need of a recognition from anyone else, that by the same token, it's no longer in a reciprocal relationship with anything beneath it. On the contrary, the subhumans who fail to make that evolutionary transition become so thoroughly dehumanized that they effectively are enmeshed in the machinery of production and turned into robots that serve the purposes of the Übermenschen, who are the completion of the full actualization of the human potential. Okay, so look, to make this concrete, you can look at it in terms of singularity level technologies. And I think that there are passages, I argue, in Fundamental Thinkers, I quote some of these passages, that Nietzsche is already foreseeing this, and his conception of the speciation of humanity, the bifurcation of mankind, and the rise of the Übermensch in one direction, and the transformation of subhumans into part of the machinery of production in the other direction, is very much anticipating the concrete possibilities of the technological singularity, right? So, for example, once you have people who are genetically engineered to remove all hereditary diseases and defects, they've been gene edited to maximize their IQ and their the ease with which they can develop their physiques, and the various human capacities like sight and hearing and so forth have also been genetically maximized. And then maybe you even have a certain degree of integration of cybernetic components into these individuals to make them even more resilient to environmental conditions and make them even more physically capable under various adverse conditions. That Superman is no longer going to need a worker class to serve its purposes. It's no longer going to need to tyrannize over and exploit relatively less fortunate members of the same society. Rather, for all of those purposes that don't involve creative reflection and dynamically innovative insight and so forth, we just manufacture a race of robots to carry on, repetitive labor in an autonomous manner. And, those could be robots that look nothing like people. I mean, they could be, automatized factories, automatized delivery systems of the kind that we're seeing.
You remember that, right?
Or they could be, humanoid robots. But in any case, there's no need for an underclass. And so there's no need for the Übermenschen to have the kind of psychological recognition that Hegel thinks that the master needs from the slave, and that Marx argued can only come about through the collapse of the master-slave dialectic in the utopian communist society of the future, right? And so this now brings us closer to the core of your question, which is that given the way that various advancing technologies are being used in our approach toward the singularity as we kind of enter the event horizon of the singularity, given the manner in which artificial intelligence, social media, ubiquitous communication, the capacity for, seamless, flawless simulacra of all kinds to provide us with endless diversions and distractions, and the mediation of all communication to the point where, it's impossible to discern the authenticity of a representation, right? Given the ways in which all of these technologies are being degeneratively deployed, right? What kind of elite is going to ultimately consolidate control over this maelstrom of technological development as the masses are dehumanized to the point where either they become robots themselves through Neuralink and cybernetic integration, or they're simply replaced by a race of robots because they become an extraneous workforce, right? Or let's say, you plug them all into the matrix because they're biomass that's useless, as Henry Kissinger put it, useless eaters, and just stick them all into the pods. You use them as batteries while they're submersed into a, cybernetically submersed into a virtual landscape. So there are all these extremely dystopian outcomes that we could imagine, none of which are what Nietzsche was getting at when he envisioned what he called aristocracy of the future, a class of higher men that eventually evolves into the Overman, which is radically different from mankind. What Nietzsche's envisioning, when you look at his ethical descriptors of the Übermensch, and thus spoke Zarathustra, or the genealogy of morals, or the gay science, and so forth, when you look at the various ethical characteristics of the Übermensch in terms of boundless intellectual curiosity, just insatiable will to artistic creation, and nobility of spirit, right? To the degree that somebody is impeccably honorable, right? When you look at all these various psychological characteristics of the Overman as Nietzsche conceives of him, you can see that very much it is on a continuum with the Comtean sociocrats and the philosopher guardians envisioned by Plato in Republic. And it is diametrically at odds with the kind of degeneration even of the elite into, tyrants whose most base impulses have been empowered by singularity level technologies and
like the Nordics.
Right. So the idea that we could wind up in a tyranny where shrewd but sadistic overlords use technology that could positively transform us in all kinds of superhuman ways to actually ingratiate themselves and indulge their own worst impulses at the expense of everyone else who is ensconced into the most unbreakable, flawless machinery of enslavement that one can imagine, right? That is a very real possibility that is actually on the immediate horizon for us. And a great deal of my philosophical project has ultimately aimed at addressing that. So, yeah, the question then becomes how, given the constraints, the time constraints, and the various constraints of social crises and, the difficulty of reshaping power structures and having concrete political influence, how do we avert that, ultimately dystopian outcome that is staring us in the face right now?
And I would also add, not just averting the potential tyrants, but even averting the potential for certain beings that could have otherwise been great Übermensch type leaders from just succumbing to never coming out of their room, from just succumbing to enjoying, the kind of Apollonian pleasures, if you will, that AI would be able to bestow upon people, as opposed to actually making something of themselves. I also don't want to discount that aspect of it as well. And I'm just thinking, what could be a proper kind of disciplinary action that could be done for people whose potential is seen, so that they don't end up wasting that potential?
Well, Nietzsche says something extremely harsh in this regard. And that's that, and I quote it in Fundamental Thinkers, that's that the same conditions that will lead to the degeneration and atrophy of the vast majority of people will act as a breeding agent that differentiates the type of the higher man and affords him the opportunity to distinguish himself. In other words, those who succumb are undeserving. And the progenitors of the Superman will be revealed precisely in their endurance in the face of the greatest danger. And this idea is in Heidegger also, that the saving power grows amidst the greatest danger when faced with the world-encompassing and instrumentalizing force of modern technology. Heidegger also has this idea that as we reach that apocalyptic moment when the entire world could be inframed and enmeshed by technological science, and what we had taken to be the human essence is itself in danger of being instrumentalized, it is precisely in that moment that there is the potential for a new relationship to the highest possibility of human existence to show itself. And I think that that's true. Now, what form it takes politically is another story. And whatever form that is, it's not going to be democratic. And this brings us back to another theme that runs throughout the history of philosophy. I mean, you look at every one of these great white men, talk about a politically incorrect
Old
cover.
white men, yeah.
Old great white men, right? Not dead. They're not, none of them are dead though, in any real sense. And every single one of them is an enemy of democracy. Every single one, without exception. We start with Heraclitus. This guy, when his fellow Ephesians staged a democratic revolt against the satrap Hermodorus, who was governing Ephesus on behalf of the Persian Empire, said that all of his fellow countrymen should be hanged to the last man, and the city should be left to the children, which is consonant with Plato arguing in Republic that in order to implement his ideal educational system and reconstruct the state on the basis of it, everyone over the age of 15 needs to go bye-bye. He doesn't explain where they're going to go bye-bye. It's like that Twilight Zone episode where there's that boy who can wish people into the cornfield.
Yeah.
Right?
By the way, a close friend of mine, James Sheldon, back before he died, he directed that episode. I just happened to meet the director of that particular Twilight episode. Interesting guy. Like, he was a bisexual man who, again, like back in the 1940s, 50s, you wouldn't really expect something like that to be in effect. But apparently, and I don't want to derail this conversation talking about this guy, but I do think it's important to say that he did talk about how sexually open the 1950s was in comparison to what we think. Like, I don't know exactly what that says, but I do think that there was that bit of individualism going on back then at a time when you would expect people to be stuffy. Meanwhile, today it seems like the opposite. Like, there's a lot of pornographic things out there, but as far as the individual will to, be free, it seems to be less so.
I agree. I'm not surprised, though, in this particular case, because Rod Serling was an incredibly progressive person, who, by the way, was Jesse Michaels' uncle.
Wow.
American Alchemy, Jesse Michaels. I believe his uncle was Rod Serling. And yeah, I mean, he was a very progressive guy. So that he would have this person working, as under him as a director for one of the episodes doesn't surprise me. Anyway, but to go back to the point, which is not entirely unrelated to what you're raising about sexuality, every one of these thinkers is just radically anti-democratic. Why? Because, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Carl Schmitt very effectively argue in their respective works, every properly democratic society has to be bound together by the traditional, unquestioned values of that particular people. And that's why democracies only work when they're relatively homogeneous and based on a particular national heritage or religious ideology. So, for example, you also see that very effective democracies can cohere around some relatively conservative, zealous form of religious belief, which is why Islamic democracies are entirely possible, okay? They're just absolutely inimical to individual rights, including the rights of half the human population, namely women, right? But democracies tend to be conservative, and they need what Rousseau calls a civic religion to bind them together. And this is precisely what Socrates and or Plato questioned from the foundation of philosophy onward. Namely, the civic religion of Athens is what Socrates was executed for questioning. And then you got Plato, again, like I said at the outset, proposing that philosophers redesign the religion of the whole society, right? Well, that's not democratic, okay, to say the least. And the thing is that this is still true. And the reason why America is so dysfunctional is that it's trying to combine democracy with what is actually a radically different form of government, namely a republic based on the protection of individual liberties as they have been determined by philosophers. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and company were basing their constitutional order on philosophical arguments about what is conducive for the development of the human individual, philosophical arguments crafted by fellow founders like Tom Paine and by more fundamental European Enlightenment thinkers that these gentlemen had on their desks when they were penning the grounding documents of this country. That kind of system based on inalienable rights that cannot be voted away by a majority, no matter how large, is not a democracy. And the attempt to intermesh it and synthesize it with democracy is completely misguided and destined to, to face its eventual demise. And we're seeing that right now. So to the extent that America can remain democratic, it will be by transforming America into a Christian theocracy. And there's a very clear attempt to do this right now. It is, you have to be blind not to see how the UFO disclosure discussion, which is the most important political discussion taking place right now, is being entirely dominated by a Christian fundamentalist discourse, whether it's evangelical or whether it's trad Catholic, and by the way, consonant with orthodoxy as well. This is definitely a machination being deployed by people who want to transform America into a theocracy. And we're already trying to do so in the George W. Bush administration, where W and Condoleezza Rice and so forth used to get together every day, every morning for prayer breakfasts and so forth.
Would you say that they were
like Collins elite behind that? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Would you say that the George W. group with Condoleezza Rice and so on, would you say they were true believers or they were phoning it in for the sake of this greater agenda?
I think some of them were true believers who are being manipulated, and others of them were extremely cynical. And where it becomes really disturbing is in a figure like Dick Cheney, because it's recently come to light through testimony of David Grush and other insiders involved in the UFO so-called disclosure discussion, that Dick Cheney, before, up to the time that he died, was at least a member of the organization conventionally termed Majestic, MJ-12, the highest level scientifically and technically competent policymaking group with regard to the UFO subject. And this group is at odds with the Collins elite. The Collins elite are Christian theocrats who believe that the Majestic group and their military, industrial, technical apparatus are in league with Satan, and who are effectively engaging in liaisons with demons for the sake of empowering the United States with, exotic technology. So the idea that Dick Cheney, as a member of Majestic, would be involved in a political administration that's full of evangelical Christians and, you know, other religious fundamentalists. I believe FBI Mueller was a member of Opus Dei, you know, so there's tradcaths involved in this as well. There are tradcaths, by the way, who also made it to high levels of the CIA, who belong to organizations like the Knights of Malta and the Jesuit Order. But, you know, Dick Cheney's involvement with these individuals is very peculiar because they seem to be on opposite sides of this struggle. Now, it gives me no consolation that someone like Dick Cheney is opposing the theocrats insofar as he's a member of Majestic. This is like being really between the, you know, between Iraq and a hard place, literally, right? It was Dick Cheney's company Halliburton that took us to Iraq, you know, so that they could enrich themselves like the oligarchs that they are. So this is not very reassuring. And then, you know, you look at something like the abduction of General McCaslin, Neil McCaslin, who was also a member of Majestic, and who, unlike Dick Cheney, seemed like a much more noble-minded person who had very genuine intellectual interests and, you know, wanted some greater degree of transparency on the UFO subject, whether we want to call that disclosure or not, to proceed in a way that was actually enlightening people and raising their level of understanding, right? When you look at something like the abduction of this gentleman, you know, it's cause for a tremendous degree of concern where we're headed in this country, right? Especially in the context of the potential assassination and disappearance of all these other scientists. There is a real power struggle ongoing in America, which will end with the overthrow of the United States government in some fashion, and may ultimately take the form of the establishment of a Christian theocracy in this country, which obviously I'm keen on resisting by any and all means necessary, right? But the question then becomes, what is the alternative? And, you know, what are the global possibilities of that alternative in terms of carving out the kind of future for humanity that, you know, the fundamental thinkers, you know, from Plato to Comte and Nietzsche wanted to see unfold?
It's a good question, Jason. And when it comes to certain countries out there, I'd say like Ukraine, that has pressure on it right now from being invaded by Russia, I am seeing a lot of really quick growth. I mean, say what you will about these Muslim Arab nations right now that are paying Ukraine money, but to me, that at least shows that the competency of Ukraine is being recognized the world over right now. And so maybe there is hope there. But when it comes to the Dick Cheneys of the world, if we think back to 9/11 and the kind of things that you were talking about there in relation to the possibly the Nordics, the breakaway civilization, where exactly would you say, if Dick Cheney is MJ-12, where exactly does he align or disalign with the breakaway civilization?
I am under the impression, based on the decades of research that I've done, you know, which culminated in, I mean, you know, I wouldn't say culminated in the book Closer Encounters in 2021, but Closer Encounters is the outcome of decades of research, and I've continued to do this research and to look at different possibilities and, you know, modify my view in certain ways accordingly. But after decades of research that I've done on this subject, and certain background knowledge that I've had and conversations I've engaged with, conversations that I have been engaged with, I am under the impression that high-level military and intelligence officials and industrialists who they brought in, and obviously they needed, and who they used to bring most of these programs out of the purview of the state and public accountability and into the domain of private corporations, that these military, intelligence, industrial elites have, on the one hand, been making significant and in some cases disturbing concessions to the Nordics, but on the other hand, buying time to develop a deterrent. And this is a very dangerous subject to talk about, because if in fact this is the case, stealth and secrecy are of the essence in our having a fighting chance at the right moment to stage a revolt in the name of our freedom and independence, right? So, in short, I think that if these individuals wanted to simply hand the American people and the planet at large over to some hierarchical, tyrannical overlords, they would have done so already, right? I mean, suppose the Nordics come to them. It's 1952, and Eisenhower's president. And they come and say, look, we need you to keep this under wraps for a while for us, because your society isn't really ready yet to integrate with us in the most constructive way. And what they really mean by that is that we haven't had enough time to dissolve the basic structures of your society to the point where, you know, your people have mush for brains and you lose all your critical capacities, and religion makes a comeback, and there's going to be retardation again on a mass scale. And then we can more effectively reduce you to a medieval feudal serf society, right? This is really what they mean by saying that, well, give us 50 years, give us 70, 80 years to work on your society to make people more ready to accept integration with us in a way that we can offer the proper guidance, you know, to the majority of the denizens of Earth. Look, unless they're completely stupid, the military intelligence industrialists around, let's say, Eisenhower, would have realized that giving them that kind of time in a way that completely aligns with their agenda and, you know, does their bidding sincerely is nothing other than slowly, you know, serving up humanity on a plate, right? So they would have just said, why even bother? Like, if the point is to enslave mankind, just let's say, let's disclose this tomorrow, and they'll come in their saucers and they'll just take everything over. And it may be harder for them to take over than they would like. And maybe we'll have a fighting chance, actually. But look, if the point is to hand it all over to them anyway, why buy this kind of time, right? The reason why you would buy the time is if you were intending to develop countermeasures. If you were intending to play these people and to develop a kind of relationship where, you know, you're clandestinely reverse engineering things and building up an infrastructure that's capable of resisting them at the 11th hour in the crucial moment. So one may suspect that, you know, this is possibly what's been done. The problem with that, as I pointed out in many previous podcasts, is that you need a crime syndicate to do that. The kind of organization that you need to manage something like that effectively is essentially a mafia. And those kinds of organizations are just like incredibly inclined toward corruption, right? Once you set up an unaccountable crime syndicate and you go around behaving like mafiosos, well, that's exactly what you're going to become, right? Over the long
run. But
let's
not forget that it was the Medici family that brought about the Renaissance, in part thanks to people like Gemistus Plethon, who brought the works of Plato over to them. So I don't know. Like, I see what you mean, but then there sometimes is a little bit of romance when it comes to certain rogue criminal elements that may want to take the future into their own hands. I don't know.
This is exactly the point, Lev. So, you know, that was the perfect comeback.
Now, before
I hate to say this. I really hate to say this, and we can in Q&A. I think we'll have an opportunity to address, to some extent, maybe minimal. And I really don't want to get into it at great length. But what has happened in Iran over the past 4 months? In view of the catastrophic mismanagement of this war in Iran and the miscarriage of the possibility to develop a progressive and powerful replacement of the Islamic Republic in the form of a kind of Promethean Persia, there is no alternative to what you just said. None whatsoever. Everything hangs on whether in this crime syndicate there are mafiosos like Lorenzo de Medici. Period. End of discussion. There is absolutely no other concrete possibility moving forward other than that somebody like a Peter Thiel, but certainly not Peter Thiel, because from everything that I've heard and been able to put together, he's actually running the fucking Collins elite right now, clandestinely, which is incredibly cynical considering how Palantir frames itself as this quasi-Promethean organization and so forth. But somebody like a Peter Thiel or I don't even want to mention Elon Musk. I mean,
I knew you were going to say
he's such a fucking tool. I don't even want to, I know who his handlers are. I mean, he's a willfully blind person who is just being used as a finely tuned mechanism for various diversion and disinformation operations, including SpaceX, which is never going to take us to Mars in rockets, by the way. Okay. Anyway, but somebody like an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or so forth has to show up from within this corporate industrial elite that has military intelligence access and authorization, and it should be more than one individual. I mean, also the Italian Renaissance did not rest, solely on the shoulders of Lorenzo de Medici. Okay, but a group of such individuals have to fully endorse and embrace the rule of philosophers, which is an incredibly tall order. It's an incredibly tall order, and there's literally like 10 to 15 years left in which this has to happen. And if it doesn't, we are looking at thousands of years of abject human tyranny and servitude, period, end of discussion.
It's just as tall of an order as what we were talking about with the rise of the Übermensch, despite all these gravitational forces pulling us downwards. But if you are right, Jason, when it comes to the wellspring of the Übermensch occurring during these very emergency type of situations, then maybe the same would apply towards this theoretical criminal syndicate.
Exactly. And so actually, it's a kind of refutation by experiment for Nietzsche, because if these people don't show up, look, there's a prophetic dimension to the writings of a philosopher, and there's a prescriptive dimension, right? And this often is lost on people in terms of their approach to my work. Sometimes people look at various things that I say, whether it's in the formal context of my philosophical writings or even whether I'm cheerleading on X, and they think that I'm making predictions or engaging in, oracular prophetic, sayings that turn out to be false and that show how grossly misguided I am. No, sometimes I'm trying to prescriptively will something into being that maybe I think is incredibly unlikely, right? But that I'm willing to invest my energy entirely in trying to possibly shift the pendulum, right? So there's a prescriptive aspect to what a philosopher does, and then there's a predictive aspect. I mean, Hegel had this idea that, the owl of wisdom only arrives at the end of an age, and that, like, philosopher, I don't really appreciate this very much, but there is an extent to which it's true that philosophers can sometimes be summarizing figures who come toward the end of an epoch and their writing most clearly expresses and crystallizes the logic of an age. So they show the logos, the narrative structure, the inner order, the dialectical forces at play in a certain epoch of history, coming actually at the end of that epoch and kind of summarizing it and looking back on it, right? It's the owl of Minerva, you know, in Hegel's thought. But then also there's a predictive aspect to the work of philosophers, where if you look at, you know, some of the things that Auguste Comte wrote about, they were truly predictive. And in fact, he wrote a book, I think it was called 1927 or something like that, which was a work of science fiction. He was writing in the mid-1800s. And so there is this science fictional, you know, Isaac Asimov type aspect to the work of somebody like Comte and Nietzsche, where Nietzsche correctly predicted that the history of the 20th century would unfold as a power struggle between America and Russia, and that Europe would become a more peripheral, a battleground for these, you know, major world powers, that Europeans were, for the time being, going to be sidelined in history. Oh, and not sidelined exactly, but that they were going to be important only insofar as they were a battleground for the rising power of America and Russia. And he got that right, you know, decades in advance of when it unfolded, right? And he made other interesting predictions that came to pass. So there's a predictive aspect of a philosopher. And if it turns out that these Renaissance men never show up, such that we can really establish the conditions for the rise of the Overman, predictively, Nietzsche will have turned out to be wrong about that. And that's a hell of a mistake to make. Okay. But it doesn't negate the worth of Nietzsche's endeavor prescriptively as an advocate of this kind of human, or let's say superhuman future, right? And so, you know, I mean, I'm not going to say we'll have to see. Obviously, I've been making great efforts in my life at great risk and grave cost to try to create these conditions and to engage with different individuals and groups that could basically coalesce into the embryonic matrix for, you know, such an enterprise. But I haven't seen the Lorenzo de Medicis, you know, of the black world emerge yet into the light.
Well, if you guys are out there, be sure to buy Jason's book, and also patreon.com/break the rules. We want to see you at some of the BTR NYC events in Manhattan. So next time, Jason, when you're going
By
to
the
be
way,
in the city.
let me say something else about that, Lev. I appreciate the plug. I appreciate the plug. But frankly, these people are already reading my work. It's very clear to me, based on the conversations that I've had, especially with certain people in the deep state and intelligence, certain corporatists, that these people are already aware of my work. And so it's a question of conscience. It's a question of who they want to be. And how long do they want to wait before the situation is so dire that, you know, all the king's men can't put it together again? Okay? And I use that phrase very deliberately. So, no, he who has ears, let him hear. Right, he who has ears, let him hear, you know? There's only so much time left for us to turn this around.
Absolutely, Jason. Now, before we go to Super Chats, and I will be addressing these two Super Chats for $5 before I put up the $10 wall. That's just for the sake of making sure that we're able to get to all the Super Chats. So $10 would be the minimum. But before that, I would be remiss, Jason, and I know that we got to get to the Super Chats real soon, so I don't know how much you would be able to speak about this, but I was really interested in finding out more about Heidegger, and I have the following question for you regarding Heidegger. So, if the Overman exists beyond the Cartesian grid that still engraves our reality, and if all knowledge is radically historicized and contingent on the prevailing paradigm of inframing, or Gestel, how can we know anything authentically? Are there any limits to how fundamentally a new creator can alter or reframe reality itself?
So this goes back to what I was saying earlier in our conversation about how Plato and Aristotle are not as different from Nietzsche and Heidegger as people think. And that a lot of the transformation that took place deconstructively to bring about the worldview of Nietzsche and Heidegger was not taking Plato and Aristotle as its target, but was really deconstructing Platonism and the kind of representationalist conception of reality and the mind's relation to reality that was developed by Platonists and by Christians. Okay? So the representationalist view of the world, which is a view where truth is veritas, is the idea that there is some objectively existent reality, some cosmic lattice that would be what it is independently of the existence of the human mind. No, very important point. Independently of the existence of the human mind. But the human mind can become a microcosm that through the cultivation and purification of its rational faculties will eventually be able to perfectly mirror the structure of this lattice and to effectively describe the constitution of reality, capital R, in a way that makes scientific inventions possible because those inventions embody an understanding of the principles of nature. That's the representationalist view of the world. And again, you don't find it in Plato or in Aristotle. It's later. And it's a kind of Christian development of Platonism that leads to it, and it sort of culminates in Descartes, who frankly, as I pointed out in Prometheus and Atlas, was literally a Jesuit agent. Okay? So this conception of the world is deconstructed by Nietzsche, and then further by Heidegger, who actually, if you ask me, and I think it comes across very clearly in Heidegger, are really going back toward Plato and Aristotle, and they're understanding truth as unconcealment or disclosure, where it's not possible to have an entirely accurate, universally adequate, and objective perspective on the world. In other words, number one, there's no mind of God. And number two, the human mind can't become like the mind of God and grasp reality in its totality or fundamental structure. Any truth is only a relative unconcealment or disclosure from out of predominating occultation. So the world is mostly occulted to us. We're mostly in darkness. Most of our experience is like wandering in a dark forest at night. Which Heraclitus says this, right from the beginning of philosophy. Heraclitus says this. Our apprehension of truth is like those moments when we walk toward a clearing in the forest and the moonlight streams through. The moonlight streams through the clearing, okay? And the point of developing knowledge is not so that you can ascertain what's objectively real. There's no such thing. It's so that you can more effectively craft things and more effectively craft your life than you would be able to if you're operating on baseless opinion. Okay, so someone who's deluded, massively deluded, thinks the earth is flat, worships roosters, whatever, engages in all kinds of ridiculous pagan.
We got to show respect to Abraxas a bit, but yeah.
Right. So, yeah, but you get my point. So, such a person is not going to be able to very effectively craft tools that empower them to inhabit the world in a more effective way, nor are they going to be able to cultivate their lives with very much sophistication at all, right? And cultivation is an important, descriptor here, because Like, for example, you cultivate a wine vineyard, and that's also a form of techne. Techne is the root of our word technology, but techne for the Greeks also meant, for example, the craft of vineyard cultivation, right? And so the idea in Plato and Aristotle, which Nietzsche and Heidegger are really coming back to, is that the ignorant man who lives according to baseless opinions is not effective. The word excellence in Aristotle, which the Christians misinterpreted as a kind of goody two-shoes moral descriptor, namely arete, right? What they translate as virtue often in the translations of Aristotle. That term arete really means excellence. In other words, being astonishingly effective, right? Doing something superbly. Being able to operate in an ingenious way, right? And so Plato and Aristotle are engaged in that kind of an enterprise where I argue, I mean, I recapitulate this. I first argued this in Lovers of Sophia, and I recapitulated in my chapter on Plato in Fundamental Thinkers, that even for Plato, the forms ultimately serve a pedagogical purpose. They are meant to refine and cultivate the intellectual capacity as projections that are useful to free oneself from customary, misguided ways of looking at the world. Okay? They're a disillusionment mechanism and a way to refine one's mind and to prepare the ground for other forms of intuition, which Aristotle calls noesis, that are not dependent upon objectively existent principles. Okay? The idea of objectively existent principles is a pedagogical machination. And the man first deploying them, namely Plato, was a playwright who had a tremendous aesthetic sensibility and an aesthetic orientation to the way in which he wanted to reorganize the ethos of society. I mean, you can see this. There's a very interesting duality in Plato's Republic, where on the one hand, he's got his philosopher legislators banning certain forms of poetry because he considers them degenerative for the moral fiber of the youth. And he has some very harsh things to say about Homer, okay? But then on the other hand, his entire blueprint for the reorganization of society is couched in aesthetic metaphors that are quasi-mythic, okay, where he's becoming an engineer of folklore. And so my point is that you don't need an objectively existent reality or transcendental moral principles in order to justify the way in which philosophical thought cultivates a more sophisticated and excellent human being that is going to be able to foster social flourishing. You follow? It is a craft of cultivation on a ultimately not just individual but social scale that Plato and Aristotle are already committed to, and that Nietzsche and Heidegger are trying to retrieve by deconstructing certain Christian and early modern delusions about objective reality, a universal God, and some kind of transcendental moral principles, which actually lead to nihilism, because your misplaced faith in this transcendental realm is going to result in terribly psychologically debilitating disillusionment when you recognize that these things don't exist. Okay? You will falsely come to the conclusion that the world has no meaning, right? And that life is futile, when actually the purpose of life, you know, as it was understood from Plato and Aristotle onward, is to craft the fabric of meaning effectively through the various projects you engage in and the various social possibilities that we can create collectively. All right. So, and our engagement with nature, you know, our engagement with nature that facilitates our more effective deployment of craft is, again, never a perfectly transparent and self-conscious apprehension of some objectively existent reality, right? Like beyond the veil of the illusion conditioned by our cognitive perception. No. It is a start and go, ever shifting horizon of perspectives that are narrower or broader, right? And this is another very important point to make in terms of Nietzsche's conception of ethics, which is that, you know, a lot of people don't grasp the fact that you don't need a universal and objective moral standard to decide what perspectives are superior to others. The perspective of an eagle is superior to that of a rat, because rats are close to the earth and have a very narrow horizon, and eagles have an eagle's eye view, and that's why the rat is going to wind up in the mouth of the eagle. Okay, there are certain perspectives that are higher and broader than others. It doesn't mean they're infinite, and there's no God's eye view of the world. And so, you know, Nietzsche's understanding of ethics is very effectively grasped by that kind of analogy to the variant perspectives of different forms of life in nature. None of them is infinite, and there's no reason to think that, you know, there would be some kind of a macrocosmic mind that has an infinite perspective, or one that we should aspire to approximate.
Just one more quick thing on Heidegger, and I think you were alluding to this when you were talking about objective reality. He has this example of the hammer, that once the hammer breaks, that's when the analysis starts. But I want to make sure I understand this hammer analogy correctly. So would there be any way, before we get to the super chats, you could quickly explain what exactly Heidegger was alluding to here? Oh, you're muted right now, Jason.
Sorry.
There we go.
The hammer, look, the point about the hammer is simply this, that our modern Cartesian conception of the world conditions us into believing that a hammer is an object that's constituted of parts that ultimately ought to be analyzed in terms of their positions in a spatiotemporal grid. And so a hammer is this object that has different parts, and each of those parts can be further broken down into components that are situated in terms of the 4D space-time grid, the Cartesian grid, right? And Heidegger says that's not what a hammer is at all. A hammer, your relationship to a hammer primordially, you know, in an original and authentic sense, has to do with your embodied facility in using the hammer. You have a pre-rational, a pre-analytical, you have a pre-analytical, habitual relationship to the seamless functionality of the hammer as part of your projects in daily life, like putting nails into the wood of your shed. And only when the top of the hammer gets loose and you can't drive the nails in effectively do you start to even think of the hammer as an object that has separable components, let alone as something that needs to be taken apart carefully. And that, you know, if maybe, let's say, the reason that the top of the hammer is loose is because somehow the metal has gotten worn down, and you're going to need to go retool a new metal head for the hammer. And then you need to literally put the metal head on a Cartesian grid and make sure that its size is exactly accurate to be able to slip the wood into it properly. And so then you're starting to think of, you know, the hammer as a manufactured composite object in Cartesian grid space. That's secondary and derivative. And Heidegger's point is that people didn't think of objects that way until really like people started building complicated Swiss watches and things in the Renaissance, where the incredibly high precision of components and their substitutability became vital. So that you needed lots of perfectly tooled replacement parts for highly complex machines. And at that point, the human mind projected the kind of grid system that's required for that kind of manufacturing onto the nature of the cosmos at large, so that you start to get like the deist conception of God as the great clockwork, geometer and architect of the universe, which the Masons allegedly still believe in, and so forth. Anyway, so that's the idea with the hammer.
Yeah, and we still need to have this kind of atlas quality in order to make sense to a certain extent of reality, as well as form our own frame.
Yeah,
as opposed to going.
Heidegger calls the primordial relationship to the hammer the readiness to hand. The readiness to hand, the Zuhandenheit of the hammer, the readiness to hand of it, versus the being present at hand of a thing that's been objectified, where you have a representational relationship to it all of a sudden, because its usefulness in an implicit in an implicit context of signification has been broken through malfunction or through some element in that network of signification going missing. Like also, for example, you want to go nail with the hammer and the nails are missing. You know, where there's either an equipmental breakdown or something goes missing that lights up the network of signification in a way that transforms your relationship with the hammer from being something ready to hand implicitly to something that's explicitly present at hand, an object present at hand. And the deeper and broader significance of that is Heidegger says that the modern scientific worldview makes the entire cosmos present at hand. And it alienates us from our primordial being in the world.
Oh, okay. I was just about to go to the super chats, but what you just said right now, Jason, made me remember something very significant. What you were writing about in your book, which has to do with the fact that now with the internet, we have everything available to us. But the point that Heidegger was making, I believe he was making it about the radio, which was, the technology par excellence at the time, is that it does not create this nearness. In fact, it draws people further away. I'm curious if you can in brief explain what exactly he meant by this.
The most interesting exercise that Heidegger ever engaged in was gathering at a psychologist's home in Zurich, Switzerland, a psychologist called Boss. And Heidegger participated in a seminar that included psychologists and professors of philosophy. I believe it might have been in the 1950s in Zurich at this psychologist's home. And he basically guided the participants in this seminar to bring the Zurich train station to them, to bring close the Zurich train station, so that they were closer to the Zurich train station than they were to the backyard of Boss's home, and had a nearness to various aspects of the train station, which they would describe. The boards saying the times the trains were leaving, and trains pulling in and out of tracks, and the bustle and hustle on the platforms, and whatever, each of them describing a different angle of the train station. And in the time in which they were engaging in this exercise, the train station was closer to them. Maybe actually certain people in the train station were closer to them than the next door neighbors who were out on the lawn behind Boss's house. So let's say if one person describing the Zurich train station is particularly taken with this woman who's really good looking and wearing a short skirt, who's, you know, stepping off of a train with the steam coming up off the platform underneath her dress and so forth, whatever, he's like transfixed by her. And she's much closer to that guy than anybody in Boss's backyard. Okay. So that's what Heidegger calls already in Being and Time disseverance. It's a very strange term that he coins to refer to this, of how you can bring spatially distant places close to you and collapse spatial distance through concern and attention. Today we call it remote viewing, which is another rather strange term for it. I mean, they used to just call it clairvoyance. Anyway, that's a way in which the far can be brought near. What he's saying about the radio, and he would say even more so about other more modern media of communication, is that paradoxically, some of these media make us further from the thing that they're supposedly conveying to us. Like, for example, you hear all this news about what's going on in Iran. Most people watching this don't even know anything about Iran. Almost no one watching this has been to Iran. I've been to Iran. I spent 4 months listening to what the fuck is going on in Iran. Mostly through what you could call television, I don't know, video media, right? But often not watching what's on the screen, so effectively it functions the way that what Heidegger was referring to as the radio functions, right? So I'm listening to what's going on in Iran. Well, in retrospect, as you asked me this question, I realized that actually a lot of what was being reported to me by the news media about what was going on in Iran makes me much further from Iran than I was in any number of the moments when I was there. However limited my particular perception of a certain place in Iran was, and however limited my communication with a particular person may have been, as compared to the amount of information that's conveyed over that quasi-radio broadcast about what is going on in the country of Iran. Okay? So there's a question of the authenticity of engagement with an environment that's a world that has a texture and fabric of meaning versus information being conveyed about a supposed place where things are going on, right? And I mean, one interesting difference is that the reporting could all be wrong, or it could be deliberate misinformation. And you could be building up this completely misguided picture of what is, you know, supposedly transpiring in a particular place. Versus if you actually go somewhere and engage with the people there, however limited, however finite your experience of that world is going to be, and Heidegger insists that all of our experience of being in the world is inherently and intrinsically finite, it is going to be authentic. It may be limited, but authentic. Versus, you know, what we get through various forms of mediation, right? That's the idea there. And, you know, radio is one thing. The more sophisticated the media, the more artificial intelligence enters into the picture, the more there's the capability for the world picture, as Heidegger put it. I mean, he wrote this brilliant essay, The Age of the World Picture, in the 1940s, where he said that we are increasingly being ensconced in a world picture that's like a movie that has no director. And radio and television and all mediums of communication are converging on the enframing of the world by a gigantic production that's like a movie production, except it's got no director even directing, you know, how the production should be made. It's kind of autonomous. And it's fundamentally mediating our experience of the world to where, you know, the world is becoming present at hand in increasingly deceptive and manipulative ways, right? That turn, you know, people into standing reserve. So like extras on a movie set, are
Yeah.
like standing reserve. So until when the director tells them to shuffle off in a certain direction for a certain shot, right? And the world increasingly is being turned, including people, are being turned into standing reserve in this gigantic production, which we don't know who the hell is directing it.
Sorry to go on a slight tangent. It reminds me of this wonderful episode of this show called Eric Andre. It's not on anymore, but it's about this comedian guy who goes around pranking people. He went to a Mensa conference, and those people, you know, the ones who have the really, really high IQ, supposedly, they were the most angry and meanest people he has ever interacted with. They were like pushing him around, and he was wearing like a whole knight's uniform, which I don't know how he predicted he'd need like an actual suit of armor in order to withstand these people. But later on, when he snuck into their after party at this restaurant, he was interviewing people and he was asking one of them, "How do you think the show's going so far?" And they may not even know like what the hell this guy was talking about. They were just so pissed off at him. But in a way, I think he does wink at the situation that you were talking about here, because the entire thing is a show.
Yeah, it's like the Truman Show.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, my friend, let's on that note,
Super chat.
Yeah, let's go to super chats. Let's
do it. And once again, everybody, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/break the rules to become a patron today. We have the $20 patrons who are able to go to the New York City events that happen live recording. We go to an after party afterwards, or we go up to the rooftop. Very nice rooftop up there. And let us go to super chats and make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, click the bell. So anyway, first one over here we have from Escape the Loosh Farm. I like that. The book cover looks amazing. So once again, Fundamental Thinkers. You can get that on Amazon and other booksellers as well.
Credit to DVX for the good book cover design.
And it's a hardcover too, right?
Yes, this is a hardcover, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So next over here we have Jason from Escape the Loosh Farm once again. Thank you so much. Jason has perfect pronunciation and enunciation. It's truly impressive to listen to him speak on anything. Truly blessed for being alive in his time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, it's funny. Although I'm a native-born American and a native New Yorker, you know, who grew up in New York City, was born and raised in New York City. And, you know, my mother's family goes back many generations in America, Northern European descent, going back multiple generations, even in New York and other parts of the Northeast. I did not always have perfect pronunciation and enunciation. My first language is actually Persian by probably over a year. And my Persian was better than my English until kindergarten and like socialization in the school system, because both of my parents worked and they would leave me in the care of my Persian grandmother, who spoke very little English. And so my first language, and the stronger of my two languages initially, was actually Persian. Which, looking at it from a Heideggerian perspective and the importance of language and shaping the deep hermeneutic structure of a world and the capacity for world building and so on and so forth, is an interesting, you know, anecdote about my life. So anyway, on to the next one.
And by the way, just so you're aware of the amount of super chats right now, because we may have to put a wall in terms of the amount of time that we have right now. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so 5 super chats. So that, what do you think? 5 super chats? Would you say that would be enough to cover the time that we have right now?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I can be a little flexible, but let's 5.
All right. Let's see what happens. Okay, so next one over here from Mr. Mabst. Who exactly do you think may profit the most from the decline of critical thinking in the West?
I mean, so many people will profit from it. I mean, obviously, China, Russia, the Islamic world, right? I mean, all of our main rivals will profit from the decline of critical thinking in the West. The question is, within the West, who will, profit from the decline of critical thinking? Certainly the Christians will. Certainly the evangelicals and the tradcaths and anybody looking to establish some kind of a theocratic form of socio-political order will benefit from the decline of critical thinking in the West. But ultimately, my greatest concern is that these statuesque Nordic-looking people who step out of UFOs will profit most from the decline of critical thinking in the West. Because to the extent that they want to be accepted again as gods or received as angels of the Lord, that's going to require the demolishing of critical thinking, which unfortunately has already largely taken place. And in particular, it requires demolishing that critical thinking in the West, right? So one of the most ironic and perversely paradoxical things about the UFO phenomenon and potential disclosure, so-called, is that the only people who are going to be able to resist the Nordics on this planet are white people. Sorry to bring you the bad news. Call me a racist from morning until night. Eat your heart out. The Chinese, the Muslims, whether they're Arabs or Indonesians or whatever, Pakistanis, certainly the Hindus who are still worshiping, literally still worshiping the devas, are not going to offer any, and don't even talk about Africa, are not going to offer any resistance to the Nordics whatsoever. They will almost immediately fall in line. And so oddly enough, the people who look most like these Nordics, and notice how I phrased that. I didn't say that, the Nordics who look most like white people. The people who look most like the Nordics are the only demographic on the planet who, precisely because of the power of their critical thinking, thanks to this entire backbone of the history of philosophy and the sciences that devolved from out of it, are the only demographic that is going to be able to lead the planet in any kind of a Promethean rebellion against these overlords. Okay, understand? So the demographic destruction of Western societies is not coincidental. It's being deliberately engineered for the purpose of weakening the white world to the extent where, either through its demographic demise or through its ideological retardation, it's no longer in a capacity to lead a Promethean revolt on the behalf of humanity at large. That is precisely what's going on here. Okay, so, and those Nordics, the ones who, they're not all bad, by the way. There definitely are rebels. There definitely is another side. And, as I've belabored in various podcasts and as I've written at length in Closer Encounters and other texts of mine, you can see this throughout the mythologies of all cultures, that there's another side, that there's a rebel faction, but they're in the minority and they're in an embattled and defensive position. But those Nordics who want to lord over us and impose a tyrannical exploitative system on this planet, they ultimately benefit the most from the decline of critical thinking in the West.
Next super chat over here we have from Escape the Loosh Farm once again. Thank you very much. How does Dr. Jorjani believe the Iran war will end, and does he have any thoughts on the so-called disclosure that's been dangled in our faces for over a year?
There are a number of possible ways in which this most mismanaged of all of America's wars will end. And none of them are good. None of them are good, which is why I don't post about it anymore. If you haven't followed me on X, you don't know, what's going on with me. You think I've disappeared for 4 months or something. No. I literally spent from December until last month, maybe making 20 posts a day on the situation in Iran. Okay? And this was maybe the 4th time in my life over the course of 20 years when I have dropped everything else in my life and devoted absolutely all of my attention to Iran. No more. Nothing good will happen there. Nothing good will happen. There are a number of potential scenarios, and all of them are bad. Some of them are extremely bad. And the only reason this played out this way is because Donald Trump and his associates put half of the leadership of the Islamic Republic on a no-kill list, which they delivered to the Israelis and demanded that Israel adhere to. And the Israelis were gutless enough and spineless enough to adhere to that no-kill list. Otherwise, this regime would have been gone in 2 weeks. This regime would not have survived the 3rd week of this war if all those people who Trump is still intent on negotiating with had been taken out together with the individuals who were rightly targeted for assassination within the 1st week of this war. Okay? So that was always the only way to win. I was very clear about that. I mean, Iran has nuclear weapons. Iran has had nuclear weapons for a long time. The nuclear weapons Iran has have nothing to do with the however many tens of kilograms of missing uranium. Iran has the means to deliver nuclear weapons. This war is not about that. And anyone who thinks it's about that is deluded. Trump is a fool for repeatedly talking about how Iran is never going to have nuclear weapons. Iran has nuclear weapons, has had them for quite a while now. The only legitimate point of this war was to change the regime and to have an Iran that's aligned with the West, because frankly, that's also what the Iranian people want. They're the most pro-Western population on the face of the planet. And the way to have done that was to cause a regime collapse from above by eliminating the leadership. And of course, it would have helped if, arms were properly shipped to the Iranian people. But again,
not to the Kurds who ended up keeping it for themselves.
Not to the Kurds who ended up betraying their fellow Iranians. Since Kurds, irrespective of what country they live in, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, are actually Iranians ethnically and linguistically and historically. The Kurds betrayed their fellow Iranians, will never be forgiven for it. They will never have a country. They'll never be, they're fucked. They fucked themselves forever and ever and ever by rubber stamping the genocidal massacre of the Iranian people. So point being, when I say nothing good will happen, like for example, the regime could still change. Like the negotiations could fail. There could be a way in which this regime collapses. Weapons might ultimately make it to the Iranian people. But the way in which this war has been so badly mismanaged, like, for example, what the Kurds did, will lead to internal dynamics in Iran moving forward, which are extremely bad. Okay? And all of that could have been avoided simply by targeting the entire regime leadership. But Donald Trump, the wheeler, dealer, gambler, mafioso that he is, wanted to be the tough guy who could make a deal, right, with the Islamic Republic. Because Donald
just like
Trump
with Putin, by the way, it's the same thing.
Kim Jong-un. Donald Trump loves to dominate tough guys and to force them to accept deals that are favorable to his terms. Right? That is the kind of wheeler, dealer, gambler that he is and has been for his entire career. And I was always extremely cynical about this man getting involved in this because I believed he would derail the Israeli attempt to have an actual regime change in Iran.
I do have to say, though, I do like what I'm hearing from Marco Rubio right now. He was recently making a speech where he was very specific. You do not have a stronger differentiation between the leadership and the people as you do in Iran. And my hope is that with that, and maybe Lindsey Graham talking about this Second Amendment thing, which I'm not sure exactly what he's planning here, it's almost like they're seeing how messed up things were with the mishandling of these weapons being given to the Kurds, where maybe they are, again, cross the fingers, I don't know, maybe they are willing to scrap this do not kill list and bring weapons.
I'm gonna say one more thing about this, and I'm gonna say one more thing about this, and then I'm gonna move on to the other part of his question because it's related actually, and there's a segue here. I believe Rubio will eventually become president, and so insofar as he has a more adequate understanding of Iran and its potential as not just an ally of the West, but an integral, partner of the United States and so forth, there are possibilities there for regime change. But again, to repeat myself, it's too late. Everything in the world is connected. And the way in which the United States betrayed the Iranian people and betrayed the ideals of freedom and liberty when Trump repeatedly saved the regime leadership and insisted on negotiating with an Islamic tyranny that genocidally massacred, as Trump himself admits, 42,000 people. The figure is actually higher, but let's use the figure Trump uses when he repeatedly admits this is a regime that massacred 42,000 unarmed Iranians, including women. And he keeps talking about how if they don't make a deal, the regime will collapse and we'd have to bomb again, and that would be horrible. He has repeatedly tried to save the genocidal murderers of the Iranian people. And the way in which that has cost the United States its moral legitimacy terminally will result in a chain reaction that is now unstoppable. The United States has engaged in many crimes throughout its history, okay? Not the least of which was burning Vietnamese children with napalm, burning 3,000 Americans in the Twin Towers in an inside job. And don't tell me Israel was behind it. I know the details of the degree of Mossad awareness of it and how the Israelis tried to warn the United States and so on and so forth. Okay, it was an inside job, directed, by the way, by Dick Cheney. And not the least of which is sending thousands of American soldiers into harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan for absolutely no fucking reason and humiliating this country after decades with utter defeat in both of those places, where the result of the Iraq adventure was to replace the secular leadership of Saddam with the rise of the Islamic State. Again, a genocidal Islamist regime that, massacred people and destroyed priceless antiquities, right, in Iraq. And then meanwhile, in Afghanistan, after 20 years of involvement there, and Lord knows not just how many dead American soldiers, but how many, permanently maimed and psychologically damaged people that we brought back from there. We simply handed the whole country back over to the Taliban, together with, billions of dollars of American military equipment. Okay. So there's a point at which a government commits so many crimes that are so grave that it completely loses its legitimacy. The final nail in the coffin was betraying the most pro-American population on the face of the earth, who were the Iranian people, by negotiating with the regime that has genocidally massacred them and taken them hostage. So point being, it's too late. Because the kind of thing that America will have to become now will not be good for Iran and the Iranian people. It's a very, very sad, horrible situation. There's a point, there's a ticker where something just goes past a certain point, and that happened. It happened when Trump repeatedly insisted on negotiating with this regime. So there is no bright future for the Iranian people. There's no bright future for the American people. As I've said on X repeatedly over these past 4 months, our options are bad and much, much, much worse. Okay? And that brings us in a segue into the disclosure conversation. Okay? Because the concrete political context in which the United States government is going to be overthrown is precisely the disclosure struggle, where we have, on the one hand, these Christian theocrats in the Collins elite, managed currently by Peter Thiel, poisoning the conversation with all this discourse about how these entities are demons, whether it's coming from Tucker Carlson or Anna Paulina Luna or Burchett or, Burleson, who's now briefing pastors to tell their congregations to get ready for the revelation that really it's demons who are hiding underneath their homes that are about to surface, not entities from outer space, right? This is literally, evangelical members of Congress are briefing congregations to tell their flock to believe this shit and to prepare to frame disclosure in these terms, right? So on the one hand, you have these people. On the other hand, you have Majestic. And potentially the increasingly tenuous control that it has over a vast military industrial infrastructure. I mean, vast, okay? There are cities underneath the United States which have been built up since the 1950s and which since the 1970s are bound together by a maglev train system operating inside vacuum tunnels, where compartment by compartment, these vacuums are emptied and the trains are sped across the country at such a rate that you could get nonstop from New York to Los Angeles in 45 minutes. This system has existed since the 1980s. It was mapped out by the Rand Corporation in the 1970s. There are cities underneath the ocean built by the United States inside continental shelves and inside sub-oceanic mountain ranges. So there's an entire black world of an occulted America, which at one point, this majestic organization, MJ12, whatever you want to call it, had control over, but which at this point may have increasingly gone rogue. And this military industrial infrastructure could potentially serve as the foundation for a radically different form of government, right? Where, you know, the era of the American Republic ends and the era of an American empire begins. But the most central question there is the one that, you know, we were revolving around earlier, which is American empire under what kind of leadership, with what kind of vision for the world, based on what kind of ethos, and are there any Renaissance men inside this apparatus that can philosophically orient a new system in a direction where it's not going to lead to abject tyranny and servitude on this planet? Because otherwise, you know, why even bother? I mean, they might as well hand the whole thing over to the Nordics, or just agree to be viceroys of the Nordics, the way that probably the Nazis would have wound up being, right? And by the way, an integral and ineliminable part of this deep state infrastructure is Nazi. So one thing that America has to come to terms with is that there is no future for America. There is no constructive future for America without admitting that in some form America is the Fourth Reich. Iran was an alternative to that. That alternative is closed. No matter what happens in Iran from here, Iran will no longer emerge as an independent pole of power in the world. Trump and his people destroyed that over the last 4 months. So therefore, the only way forward, now Iran can become a part of the solution, but it's part of a solution where America has to process psychologically, sociologically, that it's a Nazi entity. This is a reality. And the sooner you come to terms with it, the better. Okay? Now, there were Nazis like Heidegger. There were Nazis like Carl Schmitt. Okay? There were Nazis like, the guy who ran the Bell program, whose name is escaping me right now. There were futurists in that regime, just like you had people of the type of Filippo Marinetti working with Mussolini. So do I think that, when Werner von Braun and Kurt Davis, were brought over and became the backbone of the NASA Apollo program, that these people were somehow retarded traditionalists who were privately goose-stepping and saluting Hitler from their heart of hearts? No, I don't think so. I don't think that they would have, brought America into the new frontier through the Apollo program in the way they did, as duplicitously as they may have, had they been, those kinds of retarded traditionalists. So there were Nazis and there were Nazis. And there is an element of this American deep state which is definitely Nazi and certainly fascistic in the way it thinks and operates. Look, when you have people describing American soldiers on special forces operations in the jungles of Indonesia, describing how American-made saucers coming from Lockheed hangars or from, Raytheon are landing in the jungle and they're loading abducted third world children onto them, because these children have been identified as particularly psychically gifted, and no one's going to look for them in an earthquake and flood devastated zone, or their parents have been bought off, and you're flying them back electrogravitationally to underground facilities where, you know, they're going to be provided with enough comfort to become essentially lab rats in, you know, Stranger Things style, you know, underage lab rats to basically, you know, psychotronically fly these saucers for you and allow you to develop all these. That is absolutely fascistic behavior, but it's also inextricable from the underground power that America has developed over the last, let's say, 80 years. And so if we're going to make a transition out of a Republican form of government into something else, and by the way, there are only two options there, realistically. One is a Christian theocracy, and the other is a secular American empire. There's no third option. And the secular American empire has a Nazi and a fascist element to it, which has to be integrated in some way that is constructive and beneficial to as many people as possible. That's the option you're left with. And you can go bang your head against the wall from out of delusions that anything else is possible right now. Go, you know, smoke weed and engage in whatever hippy-dippy fantasies you want, you know, have your escape into woo-woo land. I am interested in the tangible possibilities for humanity moving forward. And I don't want us to wind up in a hierarchical caste system governed by these sadistic Nordics who've been manipulating us through all these religious belief systems throughout the course of history. So if an independent pole of power is going to arise on this planet that transforms the American Republic into a new project that still on some level has a Promethean ethos at its core, a project that can transform the darker Faustian aspects of the German mentality into something that's more positively Promethean and progressive, and that's a more adequate expression of, you know, the American enterprise as it has been embodied in the Star Trek and Star Wars mythos, in the X-Men, in, you know, the Justice League, right? I mean, if a Promethean order can arise, even as an embattled rebel force on this planet, using the substructure of the American deep state, then it's going to require these Renaissance men that we were alluding to earlier to step forward in time for that transformation to be properly calibrated. But it is the only way forward now, and anyone who continues to engage in degenerate and regressive discourse about how evil, you know, the white men who built this country were, and, you know, how it would have been better if an American flag were never planted on the moon because it wouldn't have been planted up there but for the help of Nazis. Anyone engaging in that kind of discourse from this moment forward is guilty of anthropocide. Anthropocide. Because my maxim fundamentally is liberty or death. I mean, this was the slogan of the American Revolution, right? Look back. Our fundamental slogan in this country is give me liberty or give me death. Meaning, if I become convinced that the only future ahead of us is a future of thousands of years of servitude and slavery and ignorant masses subsumed by a hierarchical caste system, then better that this planet becomes another Mars. It's not the first time. This has been done before. It was done on Mars. Liberty or death. So if you're engaging in anything but constructive discourse, you're guilty of anthropocide. I'm looking for real solutions here. And like I said earlier, none of them are good. We've got some that are bad, and some that are absolutely horrible. So we have to move forward on that basis.
Now, Jason, this actually circles us back to what we were talking about with Dugin and the retard right, because one of the things that I've been seeing as a reaction to these people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, et cetera, are, for example, people like Patrick Casey, who I've had on BTR. And if you don't know Patrick Casey, he used to head the organization called Identity Europa. And at least from the kind of things that we've talked about, he made it known that he doesn't have a problem with Jews. He doesn't have a problem with Israel. I mean, he's pretty much for the United States and for the future, for the future of Americans. But his main concern is to go against this regressive, traditionalist, mind-numbing caste system mentality that you were alluding to, which is partly why he diverted away from this completely idiotic way of looking at reality.
I remember Patrick. I met him briefly at a conference, I think many years ago. It's interesting. I doubt very much that this was under the leadership of Patrick Casey that this happened, but at one point after I resigned from the Alt-Right Corporation, I was under the surveillance of a couple of people from Identity Europa. I mean, surveillance, like literally would show up at restaurants where I made reservations. And I knew I knew they were members of Identity Europa. Now, I don't know whether whoever was running Identity Europa at that time tasked them to do this, or whether these people were quite possibly feds who had infiltrated Identity Europa and who also were being used to surveil me, which, considering what we've heard about the SPLC lately, having backed a lot of these far-right groups, is also a distinct possibility. In any case, I had a run-in with some of these people back in the day because they considered me to be potentially some kind of weird infiltrator. Who is this guy with a Persian background? And all of a sudden, he's like in the leadership of the alt-right, co-founding the alt-right corporation with Richard Spencer. What the fuck's going on here? So yeah, I mean, all the more power to anybody who is working on constructive solutions and who wants to resist the retardation of the Christian theocrats, whether they take the form of evangelicals, tradcaths, or Orthodox apologists for and tools of Russia. Anyone who wants to resist the third worldism and religious retardation, all the more power to them. The only thing I would say is that it's very important for them to be cognizant of the progressive, in the true sense, quintessential character of the West and of the Aryan world at large, which is the Promethean ethos. More than the Faustian, which Oswald Spengler wrongly took to define the West and wrongly identified a West with its origin in medieval Europe. No, the West originates in Greece, precisely at that time when the Greeks are under tremendous Persian influence. And it's the Promethean ethos that defines the West from its foundation and makes the Western world so unique. So that's all I would say to any such people in wishing them well in their endeavors, is that our Archimedean point of orientation and fundamental guiding light has to be the Promethean torch.
Yeah, and hopefully by example of the kind of things that they're avoiding right now, again, the Duginism and all this stuff, people would start to come around to what exactly is real progress. So with that, let's go to the next super chat over here. And by the way, no more super chats, but I already put that pin, so I think people know that. Painters 2829. Why would Bormann and company keep Hitler alive in Argentina instead of offing him? Were they studying his physiology and psychology to engineer another Führer for a fascist North or South America?
Why has the Islamic Republic of Iran particularly the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, propped up this cardboard maimed gay Ayatollah, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the last Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as the putative supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. Why? Because in any totalitarian system, the allegiance and effective control of a mass who have been conditioned to be devoted to the leader is contingent on maintaining some kind of an aura of legitimacy based on the approval of the leader. This is why the IRGC can't get rid of this fucking gay maimed Ayatollah. They need somebody up there who the ignorant masses that they depend on, which, by the way, constitute no more than 10 to 15% of the Iranian population. Unfortunately, the only people with guns in the country. They need somebody who's going to continue to legitimate their authority over these thugs. You follow? When Bormann and Skorzeny and company went down to Argentina, it's not like, they were there for a vacation, okay? They had all these stormtroopers with them at places like Colonia Dignidad. They brought a freaking army. And moreover, the last president of the Reich was Admiral Dönitz, because but a significant detachment of the Nazi Navy went rogue at the end of the war and became a sea wolf pack operating between Argentina and Antarctica to build up the facility in Antarctica that Admiral Byrd descended on in 1946. So these people still have to command soldiers. And these soldiers from childhood have been taught to die for Adolf Hitler. Okay? So you can't... Martin Bormann was like a money man. He was like a bureaucratic manager and, a banker in a way. No one's going to follow this guy. All of a sudden, on the level of rank and file soldiers, stormtroopers, Navy men, you need the aura of legitimacy to continue to come from Herr Hitler. So they keep him alive in an incapacitated state like Mojtaba Khamenei in Iran today. And in short, that's the answer to your question. Until a new structure could be built up, they had to do this. Hitler remained alive in Argentina for about 20 years. And in those 20 years of Hitler's life after World War II, a new army was built in America. To go back to what I was saying earlier, the soldiers of the new Reich is the American Black Ops military, which is flying around in saucers and abducting psychic children from various parts of the world and so forth. Okay. And it has, again, cities underground, cities in the continental shelves, city-sized bases where they can survive all kinds of catastrophes. So that became the new military. And then they didn't need these people who they brought with them from Germany anymore. So long answer to the question, but it was necessary.
Over here from Rat the Chicken, interesting name. How do you recommend one build and maintain the courage needed to stay strong through the tragedies and vicissitudes of this strange life and work to bring about the Overman? Great respect to you both.
Look, one of the pedagogical purposes of reading a book like this simply as an introduction and a potential way to catalyze interest in the thinkers themselves and to go and actually read Nicomachean Ethics or engage in a personal interpretation of Plato's Republic is so that these tremendously, almost superhumanly conscientious thinkers can go to work on your moral fibers, they used to call it, right? I mean, reading Aristotle will push all kinds of buttons in a I was about to say a modern person's mind. No, in a postmodern degenerate's mind. Aristotle is harsh. I hated Aristotle the first. I talk about this in Fundamental Thinkers. I hated Aristotle the first time I read Aristotle. Aristotle is very hard to stomach. But, and by no means does one need to accept all of his premises or affirm his all of his arguments. But taking the Nicomachean Ethics and other works of his seriously does force you to be a more disciplined and conscientious person. It helps refine a criterion of judgment from within yourself. And likewise, Plato. I mean, Plato, to me, was easier. I suppose a traditionalist wouldn't have that experience. A traditionalist would have a much easier inroads into the history of philosophy through Aristotle. But, to my cast of mind, it was easy to fall in love with Plato and be seduced into a more conscientious way of living by identifying with the various arguments that he makes and images he crafts in Republic as means to cultivate the soul and open one's perception to the beautiful and so forth, and ultimately to be committed to fighting for justice. So, one answer is that you need to challenge yourself by reading these thinkers. And this book, for example, is a good introduction and inroads into that, okay? But a harsher answer that emerges by the end of this book in the chapter on Nietzsche and to an extent Heidegger, which we already touched on earlier, is, to quote the fucking Christians, you will know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits. At a certain point, somebody's mettle will be tested to where it'll become clear, to quote Blade Runner, what you're made of, right? I remember Dr. Terrell.
Yes.
Let's find out what you're made of. So who do you want to be? That's the question. And do you want adversity to test you in a way that reveals that ultimately you're a lowlife? Probably not. That would suck.
Yeah, it's for everybody watching right now.
Don't be that guy.
Yeah. Next one over here we have.
I mean, if you are, you might wind up in chains, literally. I mean, Ingo Swann, I outlined this in Closer Encounters, and we discussed it in previous podcasts, I think maybe more than once, that the CIA remote viewer, Ingo Swann, literally saw slave labor taking place on the moon under the direction of these Nordic overlords. These are not nice people. And if they get to come back into overt control on this planet instead of the esoteric control that they've exercised through crafting these deceptive, manipulative religious belief systems, if they ever get back into overt control on this planet and you turn out to have no ethical fiber, you may literally wind up in a slave labor camp. So, it's time to start asking yourself hard questions about who you want to be.
Well said. Next one over here from Pyromethos. By rejecting Gelasheit, hope I pronounced it correctly, for extreme tech mastery, how does your Prometheism prevent humanity from becoming Bestand, the very optimized biological raw material Heidegger warned against?
I'm not rejecting Gelassenheit. He's talking about a Heideggerian comportment toward existence that has to do with being able to release yourself from the drive for instrumental control and mastery, which some people misattribute to Nietzsche and think is comprehensively characteristic of his metaphysics of the will to power. That is not the case. The will to power is kind of like the Apollonian side of a Nietzschean philosophical project that also includes and really pours forth from a Dionysian undercurrent that involves exactly the comportment toward being that Heidegger characterizes as Gelassenheit. In other words, the ability to ecstatically let go of your need for instrumental control and manipulation of everything and everyone, right? And artists are very familiar with this because art involves both control and composition, whether it's in painting or in music, but it also involves letting go into this Dionysian ecstatic transcendence. And you're not a good artist until and unless you can do both. And you can navigate these modalities fluidly, right? And so, you know, the critique here and this question is based on false premise.
It reminds me, by the way, of the Aristotelian virtue of prudence, which is not what people think it is. It doesn't mean being a prude. It means finding that balance between those two extremes.
Yeah. I mean, Aristotle, you know, plays a huge role in his ethics. Most people misunderstand what he means by that. They think it's just a question of moderation. You know, it's where Aristotle talks about mean virtues, virtues that are a mean between excesses of vice and deficiency. I mean, sorry, vices of excess and deficiency, right? Mean virtues between vices of excess and deficiency. And, you know, people think it's a question of moderation, but it's really not that. But yeah, I mean, in a very kind of Anglo-WASP way, you could call that prudence, right? But there is a kind of equanimity, poise, and balance, like a tightrope walker, which is also an image that Nietzsche uses in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that is relevant to that. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's almost like the central Shishun Manari in yogic meditation, where you're supposed to get your kundalini to flow through the center as opposed to the left or the right extreme.
Yes, but none of which is to say that you shouldn't go absolutely batshit crazy at times. And Western man would be nothing but for that. I mean, a large part of the greatness of the white world, I really just want to dig it into Dugin. A large part of the greatness of the white world, I usually don't talk like this, but let's talk like this. A large part of the greatness of the white world has to do with our capacity to go crazy, okay? The Asians look at us and they think we're fucking nuts. They're very high IQ people. They're very disciplined. They're very focused. They're capable of discernment. They're capable of extremely competent analysis. And therefore, they're good reverse engineers. Okay, when they have a model of something, they can take it apart and put it back together again because they have tremendous analytical power and they have discipline, focus, and patience and determination. And they can also be very courageous in combat, historically, whether you look at Chinese or Japanese examples. But they look at the dangerous curiosity and bold inquisitiveness of Westerners as a form of madness, where we Westerners engage in experiments, explorations, sometimes just whimsical fancies that are extremely dangerous, but are also the condition of possibility for radically reorienting discoveries. That is a unique feature of the white mind.
Divine madness.
It's a Dionysian madness, and it exists in other Aryan populations as well, outside of Europeans. You see it here and there in Iranian history. But look, this is part of the mentality of Prometheus, and this is why Nietzsche writes in The Birth of Tragedy that Prometheus was the first mask of Dionysus. I mean, Prometheus was literally the first mask of Dionysus insofar as the Dionysian archetype governs theater, right? The theater, Greek tragedy, is Dionysian in its archetypal essence. And literally the first mask on the Greek stage was Prometheus, because the first dramatic plays were the Prometheus trilogy of Aeschylus. But Nietzsche is saying something deeper than that, insofar as this willingness of Prometheus to do, not just once with the stealing of fire from Olympus, right? The fire that's a symbol for craft's capacity that he gives to humanity, the light of science and the fire of the forge of technological innovation, not just the stealing of fire, but the duping of Zeus when coming up with the protocols for sacrifice, and the way in which he created humanity, not according to what the contractor told him to engineer a slave race, but to endow us through the help of Athena with a soul in the form of a butterfly, which is a symbol of infinite metamorphosis, right? In multiple ways, Prometheus takes insane risks, which end up with him being horrendously punished, down to this rock in the Caucasus with his eagle being devoured with his liver being devoured by the eagle of Zeus. It's madness. It's madness. No Asian would do that. Except the Japanese, who have started to be driven crazy by our nuclear bombs that we dropped on them. We irradiated them. We started a mutation process. I write about this in Prometheus and Atlas in my chapter Kill a Buddha on the Way, which is mainly centered on Japan. Japanese culture was prepared for this to an extent by the Kyoto School and its rigorous study of Western philosophy and people like, Nishida Kitaro or Kitaro Nishida. But it's really the atomic bombings that catalyzed, in a prepared mind, a process of social mutation, which has opened the possibility of Japan becoming Western, which would be an incredibly violent transformation, but it could take place. And so that's a potential exception, where you see this here and there in Japanese anime as a kind of what Frederick Myers, the psychical researcher, called a kind of preversion. Not perversion, although it's related, considering how perverse animes are, but a prevert is the opposite of an atavism. An atavism in anthropology and evolutionary biology is when a contemporary life form shows signs of an earlier stage of the life form all of a sudden, like having webbed fingers or something like that. And a preversion is the opposite of that, which is a concept that Myers came up with in specific relation to certain psychic powers, that individuals in a species can show signs of a future evolutionary state of the species. They can start to show up as preversions of what's going to, of the shape that culture is going to take in the future. And we may be seeing that in certain Japanese anime, that the Japanese may evolve in synergy and synthesis with certain other cultures, perhaps as part of a grand catastrophic collision that restructures the West at large. Those animes may prefigure, like Evangelion and Akira and so forth, may prefigure a future evolutionary state of those people. But generally speaking, it is a madness that is endemic to the West. I'm sure Dugin hates us for it.
I'm sure Dugin's not a big fan of anime either. And by the way, there is something interesting to be said for the neotenous, like the big-eyed faces that are kind of like the alien spectral jesters that have interacted with us allegedly for a pretty long time, making themselves known through the anime. And also, I just had this thought right now. This is going to sound really weird, but when you think about the atom bomb and the mushroom cloud, in a way, it is almost like, I mean, this is a horrible thing to say, but at the same time, maybe tonight's the night. It is kind of like a generative organ of sorts that ends up giving birth to something. I don't know. Is that a horrible thing? that I...
Tonight. Remember the song from the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Good song. Very good song. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is effectively what I argued in that chapter, Kill a Buddha on the Way, all the way back in Prometheus and Atlas, that what you're seeing, like in Akira, all the way, it starts in the Godzilla films, but what you're seeing in Akira and Evangelion and other such anime, Goku Midnight Eye is another one, is this mutation process of a new organ arising. It also reminds me of Videodrome, David Cronenberg's film Videodrome, which I've written a Substack on. That also brings to mind my Substack, which I keep forgetting to promote. I've written articles on a number of films, including The Shining, which is the latest article on my Substack, which I don't know if you've linked in the show notes. But one of the earlier articles I wrote was on this film Videodrome. And, at the core of that film is this idea of radical technological development altering human evolution in a way that leads to the development of a new organ with different perceptive capacities and ultimately a different way to relate to what's taken to be reality. And so, yeah, I think that something like that is going on with the Japanese. And frankly, our capacity to have been able to do that to and for Japan shows that Dugin and his ilk don't stand a chance. They don't have a hope in hell as long as we don't lose our self-determination. The only way we can be defeated is to be defeated in ourselves. No outside force can defeat the greatness of the West. That's why so much energy is being expended in trying to get Westerners to destroy themselves. See, that's what it is. And there are, to play, devil's advocate and, acknowledge the flip side of what I was saying earlier, there are incredibly destructive, self-destructive traits in white people. The white mind has certain unique vulnerabilities, which can be preyed upon by adversaries of a progressive future, okay? Like, for example, excessive benevolence and self-sacrifice for others who are in need. There is a suicidal sense of compassion embedded in the Aryan ethos. And it is, for example, what the Bodhisattva mentality comes from out of. I mean, I've argued, at length in, for example, Iranian Leviathan, about how Buddhism is an Aryan religion in literally the sense that it comes from Iran. It is not from India. Gautama Buddha was a Scythian. The promulgators of Mahayana, the Kushans, including Kanishka, were Scythians. Bodhidharma was a Scythian. Padmasambhava was a Scythian, or a Sogdian, possibly. These were all Eastern Iranian people, Aryans. And the Bodhisattva mentality is one expression of this potentially suicidal compassion that you find in white people. And it's something we need to be careful about.
Ironically, it is the anti-Semites out there who would point at the Jews saying, well, they're the ones who are bringing, the migrants in with their suicidal empathy. And they do forget that a lot of it is also these WASP ladies who, want the best for everybody in the world and so on and so forth. And I'm guessing it would be both people, although again, like where exactly the line is drawn between what is considered to be somebody who is Jewish, like an Ashkenazi Jew, I don't know, genetically speaking, versus somebody who is Anglo-Saxon or Italian.
Sure.
But anyway, over here we have this one from a patron of ours. Once again, patreon.com/breaktherules. Liam Voss 2260, who by the way, I had a pleasure of seeing him at a live BTR event. He flew all the way from Scotland, and his cat, by the way, that's his actual cat, his avatar, which I animated for one of the shows with Überboyo. Shout out to Überboyo, by the way. Anyway, he says, there forever shall be a however. Your connection to certainty severed, an exception to how you would measure the ideal compared to its lesser.
Yeah, your connection to certainty severed. Beautiful poem. I would agree with the insight, not to say sentiment, behind that. And I look forward to seeing Liam again, whether it's in person or he came to our event, right, from Scotland.
Yeah.
And I've been in touch with him. I think we have plans at some point in the summer after his semester is over for me to address some fellows of his in Scotland. And anyway, thank you for the poem. It's better than the poetry Heidegger used to write, which leaves much to be desired.
Excellent. Okay, next
poems are good. Some of Nietzsche's poems are good, but Heidegger, man, he should have stick to prose.
I wonder if he was sending some of those like love poems to Hannah Arendt.
Hannah Arendt? Wouldn't that be a treasure trove to find?
All right, next one over here from Be Outside 6517. Great advice, by the way. I always like it when usernames have advice in them. What is it about truth, beauty, and justice that make them the unchanging pillars of philosophy? Are these more foundational than our humanity? What does this tell us about the nature of philosophy? And then three more after this, and then we're done.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, short answer, yes. Short answer, yes. Just say yes. Look, one way to understand this is to look at what truth, beauty, and justice become later in the history of philosophy. So as I point out in Fundamental Thinkers, in Plato, initially the orientation is toward these three ways of relating to what he calls the good. And the good in Plato should not be understood in a moralizing Christian sense. The good is what Heidegger would call that for the sake of which. You know, like when we say in English, like, what's something good for? What's it good for? The good in Plato means it's that for the sake of which everything else is, okay? The ultimate telos. The ultimate telos with regard to which one ought to craft one's ethos and orient oneself. So truth, beauty, and justice become for Plato three basic modalities through which to apprehend the good and through which to relate oneself to the good. But later, after the systematic thought of Aristotle, truth, beauty, and justice get translated into metaphysics and epistemology, ethics and aesthetics, and political philosophy. Okay? And where, you know, metaphysics and epistemology, or ontology and epistemology, have to do with truth. Ethics and aesthetics, or aesthetics and ethics, have to do with beauty. One of the things I argue in the chapter on Aristotle and Fundamental Thinkers is that all of Aristotle's basic ethical terms are ultimately aesthetic and have to do with his conception of the beautiful, which is a very, from a conventional Christian standpoint, heretical reading of Aristotle, and a way in which we need to free Aristotle from the church's misappropriation of him for hundreds of years during the medieval era. But in any case, ethics and aesthetics are very closely intertwined and have been since the beginning of philosophy. Insofar as the beautiful is often properly understood as the good, and the good is often perceived to be good because it's beautiful, and vice versa. And then also in the sense of the beautiful as the sublime, which Kant understands. And then justice, of course, is political philosophy, right? And these should all be integrally connected with each other and interpenetrating, so that the original concepts that any philosopher develops should cut across these different domains and yield a coherent philosophical project or framework of thinking or modality of thinking. And so once you understand what truth, beauty, and justice became in the history of philosophy, the various domains or aspects of philosophical thought that they evolve into, you can also reconstruct what they mean in an originary sense in relation to the good, or that for the sake of which. So that what they are is pretty much a comprehensive description, phenomenologically, of the fundamental domains of existence for beings such as ourselves. Okay, I'm saying that deliberately in that way. So Heidegger's term Dasein, which you could translate as existence, people translate it as human existence, but that's wrong. That would be menschliche Dasein. But he uses the term Dasein on purpose, which is more ambiguous. Their being. And for Dasein, for a being there, for a being who's there in the world in the way that we are, ontology, epistemology, aesthetic perception, having an ethos, and being engaged politically pretty much sum up all of the phenomenological structures that are basic to our existence. Okay? In relation to that for the sake of which we're alive at all, namely the good. That is more fundamental than our humanity. And even Aristotle already makes this point in a very controversial aspect of his thought, where he says that if someone is essentially deficient in these various areas, so that they lack the capacity to cognize the beautiful, they have no appreciation for the beautiful, they don't have the cognitive ability to differentiate at all between truth and opinion, so that they can even approach knowledge. Maybe they lacked a decent upbringing and had so many vicissitudes disrupt their early childhood to the extent that they've never been able to even work on their own ethos or cultivate a coherent character. Those aren't humans. They talk, they walk like humans, they quack like a human, they have 2 arms, they have 2 legs, but they're not humans. They're subhuman. And Aristotle says they're basically natural slaves. So there are people on earth who are not persons, who belong to the species Homo sapien, but are not human in any meaningful sense. In the sense of
you were using the term in your book humanitas when talking about humanity. So what exactly is different?
So if the person asking the super chat had said, are these more foundational than humanitas? I would have said no. I would have said truth, beauty, and justice adequately describe the dimensions of humanitas, namely the actualizable human potential. But humanity, in the sense of Homo sapiens as a race or species, let's say, there are races within man. Homo sapiens as a species is certainly not as fundamental as what it is that makes truth, beauty, and justice the unchanging pillars of philosophy, as this person put it. There can be Vulcans who pursue philosophy. I mean, one of the great storylines in Star Trek was about how the Vulcan commitment to logic, which separated Vulcan society from Romulan society, even though genetically Vulcans and Romulans are identical, they used to be the same people, is that they have this philosopher, Surak, who developed this logical system, and promulgated a new way of life. And then that resulted in the bifurcation of this society into Vulcans and Romulans, with Vulcans devoted to this philosophy of Surak. So, there could be philosophers who aren't Homo sapiens, who come from other races, Who knows? The Wookiees could even produce a philosopher. If we can get a universal translator, I understand what the fuck he's even saying. Okay? But if you want to produce a philosopher, regardless of how different the biological substrate of the organism is from out of which this rather unique contemplative person is going to emerge, the basic phenomenological structure of that person's experience is going to involve ontological, epistemic, ethical engagement with the world, aesthetic perception, and some notion of proper or improper political structures. If you don't have that, you don't have personhood. Okay? And if you don't have personhood, you can't have philosophy. Personhood is a condition of possibility for philosophy. So if we wind up in a completely dehumanized society, let's say that we mishandle the technological singularity in such a way that we transform into the Borg, there isn't going to be any philosophy because you're not going to have any persons left. The Borg queen cannot, jerk herself off with philosophy by herself. It doesn't work that way. Okay. Wittgenstein very clearly points out how this is the case, how you can't have this whole idea about, the Borg queen, and she's this one singular mind and all the other Borg are completely dehumanized, but like the Borg queen can interact in a very seductive, compelling way interpersonally with Picard is kind of bullshit if you understand Wittgenstein's conception of how you can never have a private language and how any language using being needs to be part of a linguistic community of persons and so forth. But anyway, personhood is a condition of possibility for philosophy, and truth, beauty, and just engagement with truth, beauty, engagement with the good through the facets of truth, beauty, and justice phenomenologically describe the conditions of personhood. And there are many humans on this earth who do not fit those conditions.
The NPC people, as
yes.
people were saying in the chat.
Yes. And there are probably, I would hope, many persons in other worlds, other planets, other dimensions, domains of existence, who are persons, and hopefully we will eventually engage with philosophers, from out of those communities, even if they have tentacles rather than arms.
And regardless,
a philosopher octopus is not an impossibility, if you ask me.
I'm sure they'd be very popular in Japan as well. The first octopus
they
philosopher.
Don't get eaten first.
Yes, exactly. Although I would say that in contrast to what we were talking before about, let's say, certain racial groups maybe having on the whole tendencies, I personally wouldn't put like any kind of wall and say, well, only these particular groups are capable of having this humanitas.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I wouldn't say that at all. Look, everything with race has to do with statistical generalities. It's all a question of statistical averages. Assessments of varying capacities and behavioral tendencies of subspecies demographics, which we could call human races, is all a question of statistical averages, where there are, always outliers, where, you could have a population that behaviorally, by and large, is very limited in certain capacities in general, but as a fluke produces a few people who are tremendously brilliant and from which everybody can learn. That's that. Now, where it becomes extremely controversial and agonizing to have to manage is on a political level, because politics has to do with generalities. And as Comte understood very well, tremendous social planner that he was, to engineer a society in the right way, you do have to deal with generalities. So you cannot have huge populations with lesser capacities for vital aspects of social and techno-scientific development inundate one's country in a way that's crippling and that causes one to be at risk of conquest at the hands of one's adversaries, especially because techno-scientific competence immediately translates into military capability. And so if it were the case, which some people believe, that all of our scientists and engineers are foreigners now, right? And if it becomes increasingly the case that they're foreigners from ethnic groups that have, on average, lesser techno-scientific capability, especially in the area of breakthrough innovation, then that is a catastrophic security risk because it translates into potential military inferiority with regard to, for example, the Chinese, who have tremendously high mathematical and spatial reasoning, super high IQ people when it comes to, physics and high precision science, right? So these are serious issues that have to be dealt with. Now, in point of fact, this scenario that a lot of people are concerned about is not actually the case, because we have a deep state in our country, which still consists of a lot of white people, but they're doing extremely classified work. And the problem now is whether this deep state can, in any meaningful way, this breakaway effectively, can be reintegrated into American society in at least a semi-public fashion that would allow us to reassert our legitimate superiority over, other less creative cultures who are going to offer humanity at large less possibilities for development and, interesting innovation into the future.
Yeah. Culture is a good way of phrasing it as well, I think, because we have had historical examples, at least in the early 20th century. And I would even say, again, like I keep bringing up Jews, but it is a good example to look at in Imperial Russia, where you had this artificial quota of how many Jews were allowed to go into the university system. And I think that created a real sense of animosity from the people who knew that they did have what it takes in order to be in a certain position, but they were rejected nonetheless. So maybe that's the perfection that will never really be achieved, yet despite that, I'm obstinately searching for where people are able to be judged according to those factors, as opposed to something external, where you will at least know if you do have what it takes, then you get accepted, and if you don't, then you get rejected. But I don't know, maybe I'm being
let's also be mindful of the fact that the only civilization in the world, I take that back, the only race in the world that has emphasized meritocracy has been the Aryan race. Whether it's in Western civilization, where clearly from Plato onward, Plato is the first person who has meritocracy at the core of his thinking. The whole structure of Plato's Republic is about meritocracy. I mean, insanely so, to the extent where if you're in the Guardian class and you have a, bad apple as your kid, one of your kids turns out to be a potato, he's removed from your family and put in with the merchants or to be raised by the farmers, okay? And vice versa, if a farmer's kid winds up proving himself to be particularly brilliant and capable in the universal education system that everyone has to attend from childhood, then the farmer's kid has to leave his family and go join the Guardian class and be given the opportunities to really make the most of himself or herself, because Plato's insane meritocracy, even in the classical Greek world, extended to women. So Western civilization, and also to a lesser extent, because of the Islamic conquest, Iranian civilization, particularly pre-Islamic Iran, involved meritocracy. Okay, it is a trait of the Aryan world. Non-Aryan people do not value meritocracy. They live in stratified, caste, or feudal type societies where people are treated as types with proper and circumscribed social roles. Again, vertically organized and ancestrally based. It's Aryans who, and this is why, again, to go back to what I said earlier about, it makes no sense to valorize the Vedic tradition as an exemplar of being Aryan. It's retarded. Every other culture in the world has the same shit. I mean, you might as well be a Sumerian or, you know, Chinese Confucian or whatever. Yeah. No, what's unique about the stupid Aryans who went to India mismanaged their integration with the local Dravidian population in the creation of this Vedic caste system. It's the worst example.
Yeah, no,
of
they
what
got
Aryans could produce.
They got these sewer cleaners who clean the sewers with their hands. You know,
it's the worst example of what Aryans could produce. So to go back to what we said earlier, it's the Promethean ethos that is the beating heart of the Aryan world. And, you know, inextricable from that is meritocracy. So if you ever attack the Aryan race with the idea that you're promoting merit, you're a fucking moron. And you're going to wind up back in chains. In chains. Because the Brahmins are also in chains, in the sense in which Hegel understood that until and unless you surmount the master-slave dialectic psychologically, at least until we can have a society where robots are taking care of the needs of all the philosophers, right? But in a normal human society, if your existence is predicated on a pyramid of garbage and the exploitation of miserable masses of people who are effectively in a subhuman condition, well, then you yourself are impoverished. No matter how rich you appear to be, you live existentially an impoverished life. You're pathetic in a way.
And the same would also apply to the people who would encourage those kind of behaviors to be widespread. So people who should know better, who are living in a liberal society, who nevertheless decide to introduce like this horrible program that I saw with this Australian woman who had these colorful chains dangling from her ears, like these earrings that look like something a toddler would make. And she was talking about how we should be fair to these ISIS brides. If they're Australian citizens, that they have every right to come back to Australia, you know, after depriving these poor Yazidi women of, you know, who were sex slaves there of, you know, basic necessities. So when I look at like a woman like that, it makes me sick.
Yes. And to flesh out what I was saying about the Brahmins, you have a very instructive point of contrast with the Persians, because after all, these are two very closely related branches of the Aryan community, where the Vedics and the, you know, basically Mithraics, you could say, broke off in two directions from out of a single community. And one of them went to India and one of them into the Iranian plateau. Plateau, they named after themselves Iranian or Aryan, Aryana. Because unlike the Brahmins in India, who, you know, loved lording over all these Chandala and untouchables, the Persian emperors wanted to make sure that every worker at Persepolis and other sites got a living wage. And they had, for example, maternity leave for pregnant women, because it's dishonorable for you to be ruling a miserable population. Who would be gratified in that? You would want to look at your population and see that everyone's doing pretty well. And that's credit to you as a ruler. right? As the Persians put it, you're turning the world into a paradise. A paradisa, our word from paradise, comes from the ancient Persian idea of transforming the world into utopian garden, basically. And you can't have misery in that. But interestingly, and let's go back to the ancient Persian worldview, you also can't have noxious creatures because they're going to come in, pests, like pests, and just eat up all the plants and flowers in the garden. So you want to make sure you elevate everyone you possibly can in the society and give them the meritocratic possibility to flourish as individuals. But those who are just parasites and looters and good for nothings, who, want a free for all, they need to be cast out. And in a global society where there's nowhere to cast anyone out anymore, they need to be gotten rid of. We are dealing now with the survival of humanity. That's what's at stake. Okay? And we have to get more serious about getting rid of the fucking parasites before they're used against us to subjugate the entire human population. There's no place for them anymore.
Now, lastly, in terms of the tending to the garden, tending to the paradise, or terraforming deserts into gardens, things of that variety, would you also say that Israel also serves as an example of this kind of transformation?
My only problem with Israel is that Israel is not serving the interests of Israel. I am fed up to hear with Israel's lack of a backbone to serve the interests of Israel. How despicable and pathetic do you have to be to adhere to a no-kill list given to you by a rapist, gambler, mafioso who has zero understanding of the real and historical problems of your region, let alone what will be in the interest of his own fucking country? Okay? So that's my problem, is that, the secular state of Israel, if it were to actually pursue its own fucking interest, rather than being a colonial dependent of an increasingly corrupt America, could probably do a lot of good in the region. Definitely could have liberated the Iranian people. So it's late now. I don't know whether the situation can be redeemed. It's not looking good.
And it's hard to say from my perspective as well. If I were to imagine myself being in that kind of a decision-making role, how much would I want to bet that if I were to go rogue against the United States, who is, at least for right now, the only ally, other than you could say like these Arab states that just recently decided to play nice with Israel. And I'm not saying that you're wrong, Jason, but it's such a difficult calculation to make.
No, not really. So look, let me tell you what the problem here is. On the one hand, these secular Israelis want to claim that they are defenders of the Western world, that they're, in an exemplary way, Westerners, that they are a bulwark of the Western world, that they are a canary in the coal mine for the Western world, etc. On the other hand, they clearly disregard the interests of the West when they fall in line with directives coming from the Trump administration regarding Iran. Because obviously the best thing that could ever happen to the Western world geopolitically right now is for Iran to be in the Western orbit. Not just that, I hesitate because it's not about a question, but Iran can lead the freaking Western world. Iran could have led the West. The way that some evangelicals ignorantly believe that Israel leads the West. They're delusional, but they have this Judeo-Christian model where they think like somehow Israel is the special little country that spiritually leads the West, and it's the nation of Christ and all this bullshit.
Yeah, and they don't give a shit, by the way, about all of the terraforming and any of that stuff.
No, they don't give a shit about any of that. Now, that's bullshit, okay, in terms of its content. But if you abstract from the content and look at just the form, it's actually true about Iran. that if America wants to be the leader of the Aryan world, and I'm sorry to tell you that our relationship with the Nazis post-1945 very much defines any future American power in those terms, as leader of the Aryan world. If that's really what America wants to be, Iran could play that role that these stupid evangelicals think that Israel plays for the West. That it's, not some gigantic military power or, overseeing manager or anything like that, but a spiritual and cultural cornerstone and orienting beacon for a wider Aryan world. And if Israel wanted to really understand itself as part of the West, let alone as a bulwark of the West, it would disregard orders from saboteurs who are clearly undermining the West, and it would act not only in its own defense, but in defense of the West, vital existential interests of the West. And it's not as if Israel hasn't taken these kinds of risks before. There have been multiple times since 1948 that Israel has found itself incredibly alone, isolated, in a dangerous situation, and besieged sometimes by 6 Arab armies simultaneously. And they did not really have solid support from the United States at that time either. The USS Liberty, I don't want to really go into a lot of things, but Israel has had to be very shrewd in defending itself. And if ever there had been a time to insist on that for the sake of a more long-term, I was going to say a long-term good, but it's not, it's for long-term salvation, for long-term basic securing of our existence, this would have been the time to do it. And they fucked up. They fucked up so royally. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
I could say one last thing regarding Israel is that I really would have wished they would have gotten rid of all the power of these oligarchs that are associated with Putin, because those people do wield a considerable amount of power there. And concerning what you were talking about regarding October 7th and what may have potentially happened there with those Russian oligarchs. 100%. I mean, it's definitely not a good situation there. So again,
Israel is compromised by some of the same people that the Trump administration is compromised by.
So all I could say is that I hope for the best. And I know that there are a lot of Israeli people out there who support the Iranian people and want to free Iran. But at the same time, I understand that not everybody within the power structure there would want things to go that particular way, or thinks that it would be possible for that to be done. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. That's all I could say right now. So next super chat over here we have from, 3 left. So we have Tariq. What are your views on the American system versus the British imperial system and Trump telling the bees with the king? Was that when Trump was like holding up some bees in his hand? That I don't remember what happened there.
There is now the Iran war has many dimensions to it, and some of them are very inscrutable. There is a secret relationship between the British imperial system, in particular the City of London banking and finance cartel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The City of London uses the Islamic Republic of Iran for a lot of illicit financial transactions and basically money laundering. And elites in Iran are connected with the British. Elites in the Islamic system, I should say. And by the way, in Iran, it's almost like a joke conspiracy trope to say that the mullahs and conservative religious people in general have been backed by and controlled by the British from the beginning, from the beginning. What I mean is from the beginning of the attempt to create an effective, modern, progressive system in Iran, in the Persian Constitutional Revolution of 1906, which, by the way, was the first democratic revolution in the entire Islamic world, and one of the first democratic revolutions in the whole world was the Persian Constitutional Revolution. And the reason that it failed was because the British undermined it, together with the Russians. But the British were really instrumental in doing that, and they did it through the religious classes. And that relationship abides to this day and is very significant for the survival of the Islamic Republic. So there have been suggestions that there is a deeper struggle underway right now between the Trump administration and the City of London, between basically two different mafia factions of oligarchs, and that one of them is in bed with the Islamic Republic, the British one. And that there's a faction of oligarchs in America that are considering undermining the City of London. And another story that's come up recently that fits with this picture is there are rumors that the United States is going to back an Argentine seizure of the Falkland Islands. That Milei is getting ready to order the Argentine military to go to war with the British and take the Falkland Islands, which they tried to take in the early 1980s and failed. But this time they're going to do it with the backing of the United States, which effectively mean a proxy war between the United States and the British. And so Trump, with the bee symbolism that's significant to the Windsors and other British aristocrats, may be, challenging their control of the Anglo-American establishment, or at least oligarchs who've chosen Trump as their representative of their particular faction of the global mafia are deciding to rearrange things, reshuffle things at the highest level.
And with the City of London, from what I understand, London in general has been a piggy bank for a lot of the Russian oligarch money. So I assume there is also a connection going on there. And also, people were talking about, this is one of the favorite memes of people like Alexander Dugin, the Epstein class. Well, I'm sorry to say, but with somebody like Epstein, I keep repeating this over and over again, but maybe your audience, Jason, is not aware that Jeffrey Epstein's PR girl, Maria Drakova, was part of Putin's Nazi movement, kind of like Putin's Hitler Youth. And she was someone who was also famous for kissing Putin one time. And according to the Epstein emails, she maintained contact with a lot of these Russian oligarchs even after she denounced Putin. Her sister is very close with Roman Abramovich. And so when I see these particular connections here, I wish this was the Epstein class that was talked about. But unfortunately, that kind of stuff is swept under the rug.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, there's definitely that going on. I mean, Maxwell was also connected to the Russians.
Oh yeah, Robert Maxwell. So okay, two left over here. From Graham Patton 9623. How can someone most meaningfully contribute to a Promethean project?
Based on your own proclivities and capacities. I mean, it'll be entirely dependent on what you're capable of and ideally, what you flourish at doing, So, I mean, a Promethean project for the world obviously involves every domain of human endeavor, right? From art and, art in the broadest sense, literature, music, cinema, especially these days with AI, it's a question of taste and vision. One could do amazing things as an artist, empowered by these, singularity level technologies that are emerging.
Absolutely.
So whether it's in art or in science or in engineering or ultimately in, philosophy or related disciplines like history and sociology and so forth, it'll depend on what your own proclivities and capacities are. Definitely, one thing we need are people who know how to invest and move money through the cryptocurrency system that is developing. That is huge. I mean, there's no hope whatsoever unless we're able to control an alternative cryptocurrency system that's blockchain based. Now, that may emerge from out of the deep state itself, but part of seducing certain aspiring Renaissance men within that structure to take a Promethean project seriously would be already demonstrating competence in some of those areas. So, you know, it's like the chicken and the egg. And therefore, we could use all kinds of people with all kinds of talents.
And final super chat of the night. This is pretty big one, pretty heavy one over here. From Devin Moran, 59. Where does your moral framework lie? I believe in capital E evil exists, pedophilia, torture, etc. Do you believe evil exists innately in our experience?
No, and you should read Nietzsche. Evil is a Christian idea. There's no evil in Plato. There's no evil in Aristotle. Nothing is evil for Aristotle. If you're reading evil into Aristotle, you're reading him through Christian conditioning, okay? Nietzsche rightly deconstructs the Christian binary of good versus evil and points out that there's what's good for us, there's what's good for me, there's what's good for us, and there's what's potentially very bad for me and very bad for us as a society. And some of what's bad for us might be good for other people. And some of what's bad for us might just be like diseased and degenerative in a way that would never benefit anybody. But that's not evil conceived as a moral binary. So one of the fundamental currents running through my work as part of a greater project of the spectral revolution that deconstructs all kinds of binaries, like the binary between mind and matter, okay, is the deconstruction of this false dichotomy that Nietzsche first brought to light explicitly. Insofar as the good is relative to the interests of different forms of life and what coherently and cohesively allows an individual or a society to flourish. So pedophilia and torture are not going to allow anybody to flourish. I mean, they are socially degenerative. You do not want a society with torture as an incentive to good behavior, because that's a very weak society. Like, you know, the inquisitorial society of the European Middle Ages, all right? And you can't have any trust and confidence in people's virtue if they're only behaving in a certain way because they fear being taken to a stockade and tortured, okay? Likewise, you cannot have, I mean, Aristotle goes on at length about how important early childhood education is and how vital it is that a child benefit from the right social environment and education from the youngest age, both in their family and in their school system. Which, you know, again, Auguste Comte comes back to this in a huge way. I mean, education is like the fundamental concern of Comte in his entire project for reconstructing society, which is why he thinks that the sociocratic leaders need to really be the leaders of an educational system that's a sort of like secular religion of humanity, and they need to be separate from and above state power. Anyway, on any proper conception of and any proper philosophical conception of the cultivation of the human being, something like pedophilia is going to be just fundamentally destructive of a child's capacity to cultivate their ethical fabric throughout life, right? There's a definitive difference between morality, morale, as the French would call it, as it was framed by Christianity, versus the cultivation of ethos, which in Greek means character or constitution, the fabric of one's character, or the social fabric that gives a particular people a sense of meaning and purpose. And these kinds of things, pedophilia, torture, etc., sadism in general, I mean, are degenerative of this, and in some cases are just lethal to it. But, you know, Ebola is lethal. Hantavirus is lethal. Like, you know, this is not about morality in a Christian sense. It's about things that are degenerative and potentially could kill you. And you know, ills from which you may not be able to recover and heal, right? And so therefore, that you should be protected from exposure to. So there's a way of thinking about all of that that doesn't involve evil, which is a false construct. I won't even call it a concept. It's a false construct of Christian morality. By the way, it doesn't exist in Buddhism either. The Buddha Dharma does not involve, now there's all kinds of weird offshoots of Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, and all kinds of, but authentic Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and certainly the Vajrayana that Padmasambhava promulgated in Tibet, does not have any conception of evil. It's not about evil, okay? Even though they even acknowledge the existence of what you might call demons, and that, you know, people can be possessed by demons, people can conjure demons, etc. There are demonic forces in the world, but it's not about evil. It's just like, you know, the pretas, the hungry ghosts, and they're beings that have different natures, and, you know, they're bad for you generally. It's not good to interact with them all that much, you know? And if you are going to interact with them, you ought to be very damn careful what you're doing, you know, and why. So sometimes poisons can be used instrumentally. I mean, you know, ancient royals were exposed to certain degrees of snake venom to build up their resistance to being, you know, mortally bitten by snakes. And snake venom was also used in Dionysian rituals in order to bring about certain, you know, psychedelic states, okay, as a kind of psychotropic drug combined with other elements. And so, you know, what a Christian might conceive of as moral evil could be used in certain cases, like snake venom was used by a pharmacus, or what the Greeks called, you know, like a witch doctor, which, by the way, is one epithet that Plato applies to Socrates in the Platonic dialogues.
The pharmacon.
Yes, the administrator of the pharmacon. So anyway, that's what I have to say about evil. My work is deeply ethical. I have an ethics as a philosopher who's developed a project in all the different fundamental domains of philosophy. There's a robust ethics in my work, which is Promethean in nature, if you want to sum it up by one epithet. But my thinking is as beyond morality as Nietzsche's is, and very much affirms that deconstructive movement on his part.
Now, even though the super chats are technically over, this one fills very well into the promotion of your new book, Jason. It's from Third Eye Tribe. I had a series of dreams about being brief interactions or brief-handed one of Jason's books by him personally. The other night I had another, but asked for an autograph. Which work would you recommend?
Which work would I recommend for what? For
I guess one of your books. So now I'm thinking, well, what about the book that you just wrote?
To give you an honest answer to this question, because people do ask me this from time to time, it entirely depends on the person, okay? So there are very few books of mine. Well, okay, no. All right. Okay, here, let's answer this question adequately. All right, there are a few books of mine, which, of course, now people are so perverse. I'm going to say this, and these are exactly the books they're going to go and try to read first. There are a few books of mine which you should never read first. And one of them is Prometheus. I'm sorry. One of them is World State of Emergency. World State of Emergency. Do not read World State of Emergency as your first book of mine. Don't read Psychotron. Don't read Promethean Pirate as the first entries into my corpus. Not Artemis Unveiled either. But pretty much in every other case, I would say it entirely depends on your proclivities and personality, and also your background. Like, for example, I would never recommend Prometheus and Atlas as the first book of mine to read to someone who has no background in philosophy, or at least some rigorous intellectual discipline, like history or sociology or something like that. Okay, that's a hard book. I'm not saying don't read it if you don't have that background, but it shouldn't be the first book of mine that you read if you have no background. Oh, she's just saying, you don't remember what book it is. Okay. Well, anyway, it served as a good opportunity to make this point that it really depends on your personality. Now I have to know more about you and your interests and your background than competence, and, you know, to be able to point you toward what would be the best entry into my corpus. Prometheism is always a good one, I would say. Philosophy of the future, Prometheism.
And if people,
and if you want an intro to the history of philosophy,
yeah, there we go.
So, you know, the thing about this book is that if you have no, so I just said that I would not recommend Prometheus and Atlas as the first book of mine that someone should read if they have no background in philosophy. If you read this first and feel like you can deal with these concepts and wrap your mind around most of what's being said in there, then yeah, read Prometheus and Atlas.
And there is a quote, which I wanted to say in the very beginning, which is from Prometheus and Atlas, but I forgot, so I'm going to say it now. I'm playing into your hand, and with your own cards, I'm exploiting the impossible. Or more accurately, it's a question of making the impossible possible. Something that would bring about the one real revolution in this world of ours if people would only take it in. Albert Camus, Caligula.
One of the most dangerous things I've ever written. It's an epigram. It's an opening quote, but he who has ears, let him hear. First
Absolutely.
Quote of my first published work. Why? Why did I pick that?
And with that, Jason, I want to thank you, as always, for a tour de force. This was a lot longer than I thought, and I think it was well worth it. The amount of things that we went over today. For those who are just tuning in, I highly recommend you watch this from the very beginning. Don't skip anything. This was a tremendous episode. Jason, I want to thank you so much. And where could people find you now with this book? I mean, this book, the description of this video will have a link to it, so you could buy it on Amazon. And as far as all of your other works, please let people know where they could find you.
My main platform is X, Jason, _ Jorjani on X, and also on my Substack. So those are the two places that are my principal platforms. And yeah, this was a lot longer than we had planned for, but I absolutely enjoyed all of it, Lev, and I look forward to the next one.
Absolutely. And if you guys want to support the show, patreon.com/breaktherules to become a patron today. And $20 patrons, if you guys are around New York City, we have streams that we put on, live streams with an audience. You guys could be in that audience. We've got drinks, we've got a cheese platter, and afterwards, if the weather's nice, we go up to the roof, or we go up to a local place afterwards for the after party. But I want to thank everybody for the support. Make sure to smash that subscribe button, smash the like button, click the bell. All that is very important for the growth of this channel. And Jason, once again, it was a pleasure, as always, my friend. I look forward to seeing you in person sooner rather than later.
Likewise, Lev. I hope so.
And with that, everybody, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.